He never gave an interview while she was alive. 51 years inside the most scrutinized household in Britain. And William Tallon said nothing. Not to the journalists who circled Clarence House looking for material. Not to the biographers who wrote about the Queen Mother and needed colour from someone who had actually been in the room. Not to the television programs that periodically attempted to document royal domestic life with the cooperation of people who understood that cooperation had limits. He was present for half a century of private royal history. The dinners, the arguments, the drinking, the grief, the particular daily texture of a woman's life that no official biography could access. And he kept all of it behind a face that gave nothing away. The palace liked to pretend he didn't quite exist. He was staff. Glorified staff, perhaps. A page of the Backstairs, which sounds like an invented title, and is in fact one of the oldest domestic positions in the royal household. But staff nonetheless. And staff in that world occupied a category of person that the institution acknowledged functionally and ignored socially. He poured the gin. He arranged the flowers. He managed the diary with a precision that no private secretary ever matched. He understood the Queen Mother's moods, her preferences, her fears, and the specific way she needed the world arranged around her in order to function. And he arranged it accordingly, day after day, for 5 decades. What the palace did not acknowledge, and what the people who worked alongside Tallon understood completely, was that he ran everything. The official household had its private secretaries, and its ladies-in-waiting, and its equerries, and its formal chain of command that looked, on an organizational chart, like a coherent structure. The actual household ran through William Tallon. The Queen Mother trusted him in the way she trusted almost nobody else, not because he was deferential, though he could perform deference with an ease that came from long practice, but because he was completely, reliably, absolutely discreet. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He was also, by every account of the people who knew him, one of the most entertaining human beings who had ever worked in royal service. He drank. He gossiped, but only with people he trusted, and his assessment of who could be trusted was precise enough that in 51 years, nothing he said in private became a story in public while the Queen Mother was still alive. He had lovers. He had feuds. He had a relationship with the institution he served that was simultaneously devoted and clear-eyed. He understood exactly what the palace was, and exactly what his place in it was, and he made his peace with that understanding, without allowing it to diminish the genuine affection he had for the woman at the center of his professional life. When the Queen Mother died in March 2002, William Tallon lost not just an employer, but the entire architecture of his existence. He had been in royal service since 1951. He was 64 years old. The household that had been his world for half a century dissolved around him with the efficient speed that royal households dissolve when the principal is gone, and he was left in a grace-and-favour apartment in Kensington Palace, with a reduced pension, a lifetime of memories that the palace had no interest in hearing, and the dawning realization that the discretion which had been his greatest professional asset was now the thing standing between him and the income he needed to survive. He began to talk. What he said, in the years between the Queen Mother's death and his own in 2007, turned out to be the most honest account of life inside the royal household that anyone with genuine inside knowledge had produced in living memory. It was funny, sharp, occasionally devastating, and completely unmanageable by an institution that had grown accustomed to his silence. The palace had spent 51 years benefiting from William Tallon's discretion. It had approximately 5 years to discover what his indiscretion looked like. The discovery was not comfortable. William Tallon was born in 1935 in Coventry, a Midlands city that had not yet been reduced to rubble by the Luftwaffe, but that already carried the particular quality of English working-class life that produces either people who stay exactly where they are or people who leave with a determination so complete it resembles escape. Tallon was the second type. He understood early that the world available to him in Coventry was not the world he intended to occupy, and the understanding arrived without bitterness or resentment, simply as a fact about himself that required action. The route he chose was the route that a specific kind of ambitious, socially perceptive young man chose in post-war Britain when the traditional professions were closed by money and the new professions had not yet opened by merit. He went into service. Not the grinding domestic service of the Victorian era, which had been steadily contracting since the First World War, as the households that sustained it shrank and the women who had staffed it found other options. He went into royal service, which was a different category entirely, better paid than most domestic positions, more socially complex, and offering proximity to a world that no amount of education or professional achievement could otherwise provide access to. He was 16 when he applied to the royal household. This detail, which appears in most accounts of his life as a brief biographical note, deserves more attention than it typically receives. A 16-year-old from Coventry, in 1951, applying to work at Buckingham Palace, was not making a modest career choice. He was making a statement about who he believed himself to be and where he believed he belonged, and the statement required a degree of self-confidence that his background did not obviously supply. He had the confidence anyway. It was one of the constants of his character across the 56 years that followed. He was accepted. He began as a footman, the entry-level position in the royal household's domestic hierarchy, the role that required the correct height, the correct bearing, and the correct capacity to stand still for long periods, while appearing to be both present and invisible. Tallon was good at this, in the way that people are good at things they have decided to master, rather than things they have stumbled into. He observed. He learned the grammar of the household, not the written grammar, which existed in procedure manuals that everybody read and nobody fully followed, but the unwritten grammar that determined how rooms were entered, how instructions were received, how the various personalities of the institution's upper reaches were managed by the people whose job was to make those personalities comfortable. He worked initially at Buckingham Palace, in the broader royal household rather than specifically for the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother was at this point still Queen Consort. George VI was alive, though increasingly unwell, and the household was arranged accordingly. Tallon's introduction to the Queen Mother as a distinct figure requiring distinct management came gradually, through the ordinary operations of a large domestic establishment in which staff moved between roles and between principals as the household's needs required. George VI died in February 1952. The king's death restructured everything around it. Elizabeth, the new queen, moved into the center of the institutional machinery that her father had occupied. Her mother, now Queen Mother, moved to the margins in the specific way that widowed royal consorts moved to the margins, still significant, still requiring a household, still embedded in the ceremonial life of the monarchy, but no longer at the operational center. She moved to Clarence House, the Nash-designed residence on the Mall that had briefly been Princess Elizabeth's home before the accession made Buckingham Palace unavoidable. It was at Clarence House that Tallon's relationship with the Queen Mother developed from professional proximity into something that neither the formal language of royal service nor the informal language of personal friendship quite captures. He became, over years rather than months, the person she relied on for the management of her daily life, in ways that went beyond any job description. He was not a friend. The category did not apply across the distance that royal protocol maintained between a queen and her staff, even a queen as socially fluid as the Queen Mother. He was not simply an employee. The relationship had too much mutual knowledge and too much mutual history for that category to be adequate. He was something that the British class system had created a specific role for and then declined to name clearly, the indispensable intimate who existed in the space between the personal and the professional and who made that space function. The Queen Mother was, by the time Tallon became central to her household, already a figure of considerable complexity beneath the public image of benign grandmotherliness that she had begun cultivating and that the press had enthusiastically adopted. She was not simply the nation's favorite grandmother. She was a woman of strong opinions, considerable intelligence, robust appetites, and a capacity for both great warmth and sustained coldness that people who encountered only the public version found difficult to reconcile with the private reality. She drank. This is stated in every account of her life, with a kind of affectionate indulgence that slightly misrepresents the situation. The Queen Mother's consumption of gin and Dubonnet and champagne and whatever else the occasion suggested was not the charming eccentricity of a jolly old lady with a taste for a tipple. It was the sustained, daily, considerable consumption of alcohol by a woman who had used it for decades as one of the primary mechanisms for managing a life that contained more difficulty than the public image acknowledged. Tallon managed this, as he managed everything else about her daily existence, without judgment, without comment to anyone outside the household, and with the practical efficiency of someone who had long since stopped finding the situation surprising. He also managed her finances, which were considerably more complicated than the public understood. The Queen Mother's spending was, throughout the decades of Tallon's service, a source of private anxiety for the people around her, and periodic diplomatic difficulty for the institution. She spent in the way that people spend who have never been required to connect the act of spending to the fact of money, freely, consistently, and with a genuine inability to understand why the connection should be made. Her overdraft at Coutts, which has been reported in various figures across the years, was a permanent feature of her financial landscape rather than a temporary crisis, and the management of it fell, in practice, to the people closest to her daily operations rather than to the financial advisors who were nominally responsible. Tallon navigated this without the authority to resolve it, and with the practical necessity of keeping the household running regardless. He ordered the flowers when the florist bill had not been paid. He managed the catering when the account was in arrears. He maintained the appearance of an establishment operating normally, while the financial reality underneath it was considerably less orderly, and he did so with the composure of someone who had concluded that composure was the only available response to a situation that composure alone could not fix. His relationship with the other members of the household staff was not uniformly warm. He was not a man who sought popularity among his peers, and he did not always receive it. His position as the person closest to the Queen Mother gave him an informal authority that the formal hierarchy did not sanction, and that several people with formally senior positions found irritating. The irritation was reciprocated with a directness that Tallon did not bother to conceal from the people he directed it at, while concealing it completely from the Queen Mother, who preferred harmony in her household, and whose preference Tallon understood and accommodated without allowing it to change his private assessments. The feuds were real, and were conducted with the particular intensity of people who work in close proximity to each other and to significant power, and who have no external outlet for the competitive energies that proximity generates. Clarence House was a small world. Small worlds produce concentrated dynamics. Tallon was at the center of those dynamics in ways that made him simultaneously the most influential person in the household below the Queen Mother herself, and the most resented by certain colleagues who understood his influence and could not match it. He was gay in a period when being gay in Britain was first illegal and then legal, but socially hazardous, particularly in an institution as traditional as the royal household. The palace's relationship with homosexuality among its staff during the second half of the 20th century is a subject that has generated more private conversation than public documentation. What is established is that the royal household employed, throughout this period, a significant number of gay men in domestic and personal service roles, and that this was understood at all levels of the institution without being formally acknowledged at any level. The understanding produced a specific kind of tolerance, not acceptance in the modern sense, but a pragmatic accommodation of a reality that the institution found useful professionally and preferred not to examine socially. Gay men in domestic service brought, in the institutional calculus of the time, a combination of aesthetic sensibility, personal discretion, and freedom from the competing domestic loyalties that married staff sometimes brought to the job. The calculation was reductive, and its reductiveness was not examined. It was simply applied. Tallon existed within this accommodation. He did not hide his sexuality from the people around him, nor did he present it in ways that required the institution to formally acknowledge what it preferred to informally accept. He had relationships. He conducted them with the discretion that the institution required and that his own assessment of his situation confirmed was necessary. The relationships were known to the people who knew him well and unknown to the public record for most of his working life. By the 1960s, He was established at Clarence House as the figure he would remain for the next 4 decades, the person through whom the Queen Mother's household actually operated, regardless of what the formal structure suggested. He was in his late 20s, already possessed of the authority that comes from being genuinely indispensable to someone who matters, and already developing the particular character that would make him, in the years after the Queen Mother's death, one of the most vivid and honest voices ever to emerge from inside royal service. He had found his world. It was not Coventry. It was not anywhere that the 16-year-old who had applied to Buckingham Palace could have precisely imagined. But it was the world he had reached for, and he had reached it completely, and he intended to remain inside it for as long as it would have him. It had him for 51 years. The first thing Tallon did every morning was not make tea. This detail matters because the morning tea ritual is the one that appears in every romanticized account of royal domestic service. The perfectly arranged tray, the bone china, the precise temperature, the punctual arrival at the bedroom door. Tallon did all of this, and did it correctly, because correctness in these matters was the baseline from which everything else in his professional life operated. But the first thing he actually did, before the tray and before the tea and before the carefully managed transition from sleep to wakefulness that the Queen Mother required, was assess the day. He assessed it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the difference between a good day and a difficult one in that household was often determined in the first 30 minutes, and that the first 30 minutes were determined by decisions made before the Queen Mother was awake. What was on the schedule? Who was coming? What the previous evening had produced in terms of mood, consumption, and the particular emotional weather that followed certain kinds of social engagements and preceded certain kinds of others. He carried this assessment in his head and used it to arrange the morning in ways that gave the day the best available chance of proceeding smoothly. The Queen Mother was not an easy woman to work for, in the way that people mean when they say someone is not easy. She was not cruel. She was not arbitrary, in the manner of people who use their power to make those around them miserable, simply because the power is available. What she was, with a consistency that 50 years of proximity had made entirely familiar to Tallon, was demanding in the specific way that people are demanding when they have spent their entire lives in an environment where their preferences were the primary organizing principle of every room they entered. She wanted what she wanted when she wanted it, and the wanting was not accompanied by any particular awareness that wanting and receiving were connected by a chain of human effort that the people at the other end of the chain might experience as burdensome. This was not selfishness in the conventional sense. It was the natural condition of someone for whom the gap between desire and fulfillment had never been wide enough to require acknowledgement. Tallon understood this, had understood it for decades, and had constructed his management of her daily life around it, with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who has concluded that understanding a situation completely is more useful than resenting it. The gin arrived at a time that most households would have considered early. The Queen Mother's relationship with her first drink of the day has been documented in enough independent accounts that its general character is established beyond dispute, and the general character was that the first drink came before the hour at which most people were considering lunch. Tallon poured it. He poured it in the measure that the occasion required, which varied depending on what the morning had produced and what the afternoon was going to demand, and he poured it without the expression that might have communicated anything about his private assessment of the timing. This capacity for a face that communicated nothing was one of his most professionally valuable attributes, and one of the things that distinguished him from staff who were technically competent but temperamentally unsuited to the intimacy of the role. Intimate service requires the ability to be present for things that would, in any other context, generate a reaction, and to be present for them with a blankness that the person being served can interpret as either absence or acceptance, depending on what they need to believe. Tallon had mastered this so completely that the people who worked alongside him sometimes found it difficult to know what he was actually thinking, which was precisely the point. What he thought about the gin, about the particular rhythm of consumption that structured the Queen Mother's days, he has described in the interviews he gave after her death, with a combination of honesty and affection that resists the reduction to either criticism or apologia. He did not think it was a problem in the way that people who did not know her thought it was a problem. He thought it was part of who she was, a mechanism that had developed over decades in response to a life that contained, beneath its public pageantry, a significant quantity of genuine difficulty, and that had become so integrated into the texture of her daily existence that separating the mechanism from the person it had developed in would have required dismantling something more fundamental than a drinking habit. He also thought, and said so, that she was better company after the first drink than before it. This observation, delivered in one of his post-2002 interviews with the dry precision that characterized his best public statements, was received as a charming anecdote about an eccentric old lady. It was also, read carefully, an observation about the function that alcohol served for a woman who found the performance of public warmth genuinely effortful before she had taken the edge off whatever the morning had deposited. The glamour of Clarence House during the decades of Tallon's service was real, and it was his production as much as it was the Queen Mother's instinct. She had taste, genuine, formed taste, the kind that comes from decades of exposure to beautiful things, combined with the resources to act on aesthetic preference without the constraint of budget. She liked flowers in quantities that filled rooms rather than decorated them. She liked food prepared with a seriousness that the palace kitchens occasionally found excessive. She liked her table set in ways that reflected a standard of domestic beauty that she had maintained since the 1930s, and that she saw no reason to revise because the decades were passing and the world outside was simplifying. Tallon shared this taste, or had developed it through proximity, or had arrived at it independently through the particular aesthetic education that comes from spending your working life inside rooms where beautiful things are used rather than displayed. The distinction matters. There is a different relationship to beauty that develops when you live among fine things as part of your working environment compared to the relationship that develops when you encounter them occasionally as a visitor. Tallon's eye for arrangement, for the way a room should look and feel and smell, was the eye of someone who had spent 5 decades making rooms look and feel and smell exactly right, because someone he cared about needed them that way. The flowers were his particular domain. He has described, in several interviews, the process of arranging the flowers at Clarence House with a specificity that reveals genuine engagement rather than professional routine. The choice of what to put where, the attention to how different arrangements would be experienced by someone moving through a sequence of rooms rather than entering a single one. The understanding that flowers in a royal household are not decoration but communication, a daily signal about the quality of attention being paid to the person who lives among them. The Queen Mother noticed. This is the detail that Tallon returned to most consistently in his later accounts of the working relationship. Not the grand occasions, not the state visits and the ceremonial appearances and the moments of formal royal pageantry, but the small domestic acknowledgements that told him his attention had been received. A comment on the arrangement in the morning room, a preference expressed for one variety over another that he had not suggested and she had not previously mentioned, which meant she had been thinking about it independently. The particular quality of attention that a person pays to the things that have been arranged for them when they understand that the arrangement required thought. He made her feel, in the daily texture of her domestic life, like someone whose preferences mattered in a concrete and immediate way, not because she was the Queen Mother and preference was therefore automatic, but because a specific person was paying specific attention to what she specifically liked and was acting on that attention every day. The distinction, for a woman whose public life was a continuous performance of her role rather than an expression of herself, was not trivial. The social life of Clarence House during the 1960s and 1970s was conducted at a pitch of sustained festivity that Tallon managed with the efficiency of a very good theatre producer, working with a leading actress who had strong opinions about how the production should be run. The Queen Mother entertained constantly. She entertained the people she found genuinely interesting, which included a wider and more eclectic range of personalities than the palace's official social circle suggested. Artists, writers, actors, people whose connection to the royal establishment was tenuous, but whose company she found more stimulating than the company of people whose connection was formal, and whose conversation was therefore shaped by the formality. Noel Coward came. Cecil Beaton came. The gatherings at Clarence House during these decades had a quality that contemporaries described as unlike anything else in London. Not quite a salon, not quite a court, not quite a private dinner party, but something that combined elements of all three and that owed its particular character to the combination of the Queen Mother's instinct for social orchestration and Tallon's management of the practical conditions that made the orchestration possible. He was present at all of it, present but not participating. He moved through these gatherings in the role that the institution required of him, ensuring that glasses were filled and plates appeared, and the domestic machinery of the evening ran without interruption, while absorbing everything that the gatherings produced. The conversations he overheard, the exchanges between significant people that happened in the margins of official interactions, the private assessments that public figures made of each other in the particular candor available at the end of a good dinner when the host is trusted and the staff are considered too peripheral to register. Tallon registered everything. He did not use what he registered, not while the Queen Mother was alive, not in any way that produced a public record. He stored it in the memory that became, in the 5 years between her death and his own, the most complete private account of life inside the 20th century British royal household that has ever been partially disclosed. Partially, because what he eventually said represented only a fraction of what he knew. The fraction was significant enough to reshape certain received understandings of the Queen Mother and the world she inhabited. The complete account, which he carried until 2007 and which died with him, would have been something else entirely. What survives is the fraction. The fraction is extraordinary. It suggests, by the quality of its detail and the precision of its observation, that what was not said was more extraordinary still. Clarence House was approximately 150 rooms smaller than Buckingham Palace, and every one of the rooms that remained was a theatre for the kind of interpersonal conflict that develops when a small number of people with strong personalities compete for the attention and favour of a single powerful figure who enjoys the competition without acknowledging that she is enjoying it. The Queen Mother did not orchestrate the tensions in her household deliberately. She did not need to. They arose naturally from the structure of her domestic world, a world in which proximity to her was the primary currency, in which her approval was the resource that everyone needed and nobody could accumulate in sufficient quantity to feel secure, and in which the allocation of her attention was governed by preferences that she expressed obliquely and changed without notice. The people around her spent considerable energy reading those preferences and adjusting their behavior accordingly, and the energy spent on reading and adjusting was energy not spent on the people they were competing with, which meant the competition was conducted at a level of sustained intensity that the participants could not always acknowledge, even to themselves. Tallon understood this dynamic more clearly than anyone else in the household, partly because he had observed it for longer than anyone else, and partly because his position gave him a vantage point that the other competitors did not have. He was not competing in the same way they were competing. His access to the Queen Mother was structural rather than contingent. It came from the role he performed rather than from her current assessment of his value, which meant that the daily anxieties about standing and favour that consumed his colleagues consumed him considerably less. This comparative freedom from anxiety gave him the detachment to observe the competition clearly and the leisure to find it, as he occasionally indicated in later interviews, genuinely entertaining. The ladies-in-waiting occupied a category of the household hierarchy that was simultaneously grand and precarious. They were women of good family, usually with some personal connection to the royal circle, who served the Queen Mother in a rotation that was managed with the appearance of informality and the reality of considerable social complexity. Their role was companionship. They attended public engagements, managed correspondence, provided the social buffer between the Queen Mother and the world that the institution required someone of her position to maintain. They were not staff in the way that Tallon was staff. They occupied a different social register, a different relationship to the institution, and a different understanding of their own position within it. This difference in register was the source of a friction with Tallon that ran, in various forms and at various intensities, throughout his decades at Clarence House. The ladies-in-waiting understood their role as primary. They were the Queen Mother's companions, her social world in the truest sense, and the domestic arrangements that surrounded that social world were, from their perspective, support functions rather than central ones. Tallon understood his role as primary in a completely different and incompatible sense. He managed everything that made the household function, and the household's functioning was the condition on which everything else, including the ladies-in-waiting's comfortable performance of their companionship role, depended. Both understandings were correct, which made the friction irresolvable. Two people can each be right about their own indispensability without either being wrong, and the resulting tension does not diminish because the parties involved are intelligent enough to understand its source. It simply continues, managed rather than resolved, accommodated rather than eliminated, for as long as the household that contains it continues to exist. Tallon's relationships with specific ladies-in-waiting varied considerably. Some he respected, in the qualified way that he respected people who were competent at something he valued, even when the something was not something he himself did. Some he found decorative, in the least flattering sense of the word, present, pleasant, and without substance sufficient to justify the space they occupied in the Queen Mother's attention. A few he found genuinely threatening, not to his position, which was secure enough, but to the quality of the household's management, because they had the Queen Mother's ear on matters that fell, in Tallon's assessment, within his own competence, and about which their opinions were uninformed. He dealt with the threats the way he dealt with most things, quietly, indirectly, through the management of information and access that his position gave him, and that the formal hierarchy did not acknowledge he possessed. A lady-in-waiting, whose advice on a domestic matter had been poorly received by the Queen Mother, might find, subsequently, that the matter had been arranged differently than she had suggested. The arrangement would be attributed to Tallon's judgment rather than to any direct contest with her recommendation. The attribution was accurate. The process by which it had been reached was more complicated than the attribution suggested. The male members of the household, the equerries, the private secretaries, the people who managed the formal and official dimensions of the Queen Mother's public role, had a different relationship with Tallon that was shaped by the different character of their work and by the particular kind of authority that Tallon represented. They managed the external world of the Queen Mother's life. He managed the internal one. The boundary between those two domains was not always clear, and the lack of clarity produced jurisdictional disputes that were conducted with a formality that the domestic disputes with the ladies-in-waiting did not have. A private secretary who needed to know whether the Queen Mother would be available for a particular engagement at a particular time needed Tallon's cooperation, because Tallon's assessment of her energy, her mood, and the likely state of her afternoon was more reliable than any formal schedule. A private secretary who did not have Tallon's cooperation found that the information he needed arrived late, or arrived in a form that required interpretation, or did not quite arrive in time to be useful. This was not obstruction in any form that could be formally identified or formally complained about. It was the ordinary friction of working in a household where information moved through channels that the formal structure did not acknowledge, managed by a person who understood the value of what he controlled. The most significant of the feuds that Tallon conducted across his decades at Clarence House was the one with the person who most directly threatened the thing he valued most. His unique position as the person who understood the Queen Mother better than anyone else and managed her daily life accordingly. The threat, when it came not from another member of the household, but from outside it, in the form of a relationship that the Queen Mother developed in the 1970s, that she managed with unusual independence from the household structure and unusual opacity about its character. Roddy Llewellyn arrived in the Queen Mother's world through Princess Margaret, which is to say, he arrived at the absolute worst possible entry point from Tallon's perspective. Margaret was the Queen Mother's younger daughter and the more complicated of her two children, the one whose life had produced the most sustained difficulty and the most consistent parental anxiety, the one whose choices in men and in lifestyle had generated decades of institutional crisis management and had never quite been resolved into anything the palace could comfortably present as a success. Llewellyn was 25 years younger than Margaret. He was charming, good-looking, in the unconventional way that Margaret had always found more interesting than the conventional alternative, and completely unsuited to the life that association with a royal princess produced. He was also, in ways that became apparent as the relationship developed, connected to the Queen Mother's social world in a manner that went beyond his connection to Margaret. She liked him independently, found him genuinely amusing, and extended to him a warmth that surprised people who had expected her maternal protectiveness toward Margaret to produce a cooler assessment of a man who was, by any formal measure, an inappropriate companion for a princess. Tallon's response to Llewellyn's presence in the household's social orbit was one of the few cases in which his professional composure was reported to have shown visible strain. The reports come from people who were present at Clarence House during this period, and who have given accounts in various contexts since, and the accounts describe a Tallon who found in Llewellyn something unusual, a person whose access to the Queen Mother's affection did not pass through the channels that Tallon controlled, and could not therefore be managed in the ways that other accesses could be managed. The management of access was Tallon's primary instrument of household power. People who wanted the Queen Mother's attention, her approval, or simply her company, learned, over time, that the most reliable path to those things ran through Tallon. He did not advertise this. He simply made it gradually apparent, through the ordinary operations of his role, that his cooperation made things easier and his non-cooperation made things harder. The lesson was absorbed by most people in the household's orbit without being consciously acknowledged. Llewellyn did not learn this lesson because he did not need to. His access was direct, personal, and endorsed from above in a way that Tallon's management of the household could not intercept. This made him, in the specific terms of Clarence House's internal politics, genuinely powerful in a way that few people who came through the household's social world were powerful. It also made him, from Tallon's perspective, a problem that the usual tools were inadequate to address. What followed between the two men has been described in accounts from people present at the time as a Cold War conducted at the temperature of perfect social correctness. Nothing was said that could be quoted, nothing was done that could be cited. The mutual discomfort was expressed through the mechanisms available to two people who understood that the person they were both, in different ways, competing for, would not tolerate open conflict between them. It was expressed in the timing of information, in the arrangement of occasions, in the 100 small decisions that go into the management of a household where every decision is also a statement about priority. The Cold War ended not through resolution, but through the natural conclusion of the circumstances that had produced it. Margaret's relationship with Llewellyn became public in 1976, when photographs appeared in a tabloid, generating the kind of press storm that required the palace to manage it, rather than ignore it. The management produced, over the subsequent years, a gradual withdrawal of Llewellyn from the household's orbit, and with his withdrawal, the specific threat he had represented to Tallon's position receded. What did not recede was Tallon's understanding of his own vulnerability, his recognition that his influence over the household depended entirely on the continuation of one woman's life and one woman's trust, and that both of those things were, whatever their current solidity, finite. He had built his entire world inside a structure that would dissolve the moment its center was gone. He knew this. He had known it for years. The knowledge did not change what he did or how he did it. He continued to pour the gin and arrange the flowers and manage the access and conduct the feuds and maintain the composure that 50 years of practice had made indistinguishable from character. But he knew, and the knowing was part of what made the post-2002 interviews, when they eventually came, carry the particular quality that interviews carry when the person giving them has been holding their material for longer than most people hold anything. There is a version of the British royal family that exists in official photographs, in authorized biographies, in the careful statements released through press offices that have spent decades perfecting the art of saying nothing in language that sounds like disclosure. This version is not fabricated exactly. The events it describes happened, the people it portrays existed, but it is a version assembled from selected material, with the selection made by people whose primary interest was the institution's presentation rather than the historical record's accuracy. William Tallon saw the other version. He saw it every day for 51 years, in the ordinary intimacy of a domestic life that cannot be fully managed, no matter how many protocols surround it. People in their own homes, even homes surrounded by staff and shaped by institutional expectation, are not always performing. They argue. They cry. They say things to the people they trust that they would not say to anyone else. They reveal, in the unguarded moments that domestic life inevitably produces, who they actually are, rather than who they are required to present themselves as being. Tallon was present for those moments with a consistency that no other person in the Queen Mother's world matched. He was there in the mornings before the performance began, and in the evenings after it had ended. He was there during the illnesses that were managed away from public knowledge, and during the bereavements that the official record acknowledged, and the private grief that the official record did not capture. He was there for the arguments with her daughters, the silences after difficult phone calls, the particular quality of an evening when something had happened that was being processed rather than discussed. The Queen Mother's relationship with her elder daughter was the most significant and the most complicated relationship in her life after George VI's death, and it was a relationship whose complexity the official record has never adequately represented. Elizabeth II and her mother were not simply Queen and Queen Mother in the formal sense. They were two women who had shared the center of the same institution for 50 years, who had navigated its demands from different positions, and who had developed, across those 50 years, a relationship that contained genuine warmth and genuine tension in proportions that varied depending on the subject and the period. Tallon observed this relationship from close range. He has described, in the interviews that followed the Queen Mother's death, a dynamic between mother and daughter that was considerably more complex than the public image of harmonious royal family life suggested. He described the Queen Mother's opinions about decisions being made at Buckingham Palace, not in general terms, but in the specific, pointed way that a woman who had herself been at the center of the institution expressed views about how it was being run by the person who had succeeded her at that center. He described conversations that had not gone well and evenings that followed difficult phone calls, in which the difficulty was visible in everything except the words being used to discuss it. He did not name specific disagreements in any interview that reached the public record. He circled them, approached them, indicated their existence through the quality of his description, without landing on the detail that would have made the description actionable. The circling was deliberate. Tallon understood what he could say without consequence, and what he could not, and his management of that boundary in the post-2002 interviews was as precise as his management of the household had been during the preceding decades. What he was less careful about, because it concerned people who were less powerful than the Queen, or whose positions were less sensitive than the immediate family relationships, was his account of the broader royal world that passed through Clarence House across 5 decades. The social world of the Queen Mother was not a small world. It encompassed, across the years, an extraordinary range of people: politicians who came to pay their respects and stayed for dinner, artists whose connection to the royal establishment went back decades, foreign royals whose visits required the particular management that visiting royalty always requires, and the broader cast of aristocratic and establishment figures whose lives intersected with the royal families in the ongoing way that the British class system ensures they always do. Tallon saw all of them in the specific condition that Clarence House produced, the condition of people who had lowered their guard sufficiently to reveal more than they intended. He saw politicians who were performing confidence in public and expressing something considerably less comfortable in private. He saw foreign royals whose relationship to their own institutions was more precarious than their public bearing suggested. He saw the marriages that were known to be troubled, and the relationships that were known to exist, and the arrangements that everybody understood, and nobody acknowledged in any form that could be written down. The royal family's internal dynamics during the 1980s and 1990s were, from Tallon's vantage point, considerably more turbulent than the official account suggested, even after the official account had been forced to acknowledge turbulence. The Charles and Diana situation, which became a public crisis during this period, was not a surprise to anyone inside the royal world. It had been visible to the people with access to that world for years before it became visible to everyone else, and the visibility produced reactions among the senior members of the family and household that have never been properly documented. Tallon was present for some of those reactions. He has indicated this, in the careful language of a man who understood that certain things could be indicated without being stated, and that indication was safer than statement for specific categories of information. He described the atmosphere at Clarence House during the worst years of the Wales marriage in terms that conveyed the emotional reality of the period, without specifying what was said by whom, on which occasion. He described the Queen Mother's feelings about her grandson's marriage and its disintegration in terms that were notably different from the official family position of supportive neutrality. The Queen Mother's private assessment of Diana has been the subject of considerable speculation across the years since both women's deaths. The official version positions the Queen Mother as someone who tried to guide her grandson's difficult wife with patience and affection. The version that emerges from people who were close to the Queen Mother during the relevant period is more complicated, and the version that Tallon's accounts suggest, without ever directly stating, is more complicated still. He described the Queen Mother as a woman who understood Diana in a specific way that was not the same as sympathizing with her. She understood, from her own experience, what it meant to be a woman who had come from outside the institution and found herself inside it, without the preparation that the institution's demands required. She had navigated that experience herself 60 years earlier, and the navigation had produced in her a toughness that Diana, who was a different kind of person, in a different kind of marriage, in a different period, had not developed in the same way. Whether the Queen Mother's understanding translated into the warmth that the official account attributes to her, or whether it translated into the impatience that people sometimes feel toward those who struggle with difficulties they themselves have managed, is something Tallon indicated without resolving. The indication was enough to complicate the official version considerably. The resolution would have required specifics that he chose not to provide. The deaths that occurred during his decades of service shaped the household in ways that Tallon has described, with a candor that the official record did not prepare for. George VI's death in 1952 was the formative event, the loss that established the emotional register of the Queen Mother's subsequent 5 decades, and that produced in her a relationship with grief that was private, sustained, and considerably more active than the public image of stoic royal widowhood suggested. She missed the king. Tallon has said this in terms that are simple and that resist elaboration because they do not require it. She missed him specifically, as a person, his particular way of being in a room, his specific habits, the texture of a daily life that had been organized around 2 people and was now organized around 1. The missing did not diminish with time in the way that grief is supposed to diminish. It became familiar, which is different from becoming smaller. The way the household managed the anniversary of the king's death each year tells you something about how this grief was held. Certain things were done on that day that were not done on other days. Certain conversations were not had. The atmosphere was particular in a way that the staff understood without it being explained, and Tallon managed the atmosphere with the same attention he brought to the flowers and the gin and the morning schedule, as a condition that required specific handling rather than as a sentiment that required expression. Princess Margaret's death in February 2002, 7 weeks before the Queen Mother's own death, produced a grief of a different character. Margaret had been the more complicated of the 2 daughters, the one whose life had generated the most sustained anxiety, the one whose choices had most consistently challenged the institution's capacity to manage her, the one whose relationship with her mother had the longest history of difficulty and the deepest reserves of mutual love beneath that difficulty. Tallon was present for the weeks between Margaret's death and the Queen Mother's own. He has described them with a restraint that is itself expressive, a restraint that conveys, through what it does not say, the quality of those weeks in the household more accurately than description would have. He described a woman who was not performing grief and was not managing it. He described a woman who was simply inside it, in the way that people are inside grief when they are very old and very tired, and the person who has died is someone who has been present for their entire adult life. The Queen Mother died on the 30th of March 2002. Tallon was in the house. He has not described in detail what those final hours were like. This is the one area where his post-2002 candor produced silence rather than disclosure, and the silence has a quality that distinguishes it from his other silences. not the calculated silence of a man managing the boundary between what can and cannot be said, but the silence of someone for whom certain things are simply too interior to be made exterior. What he did say, in the immediate aftermath of her death, was characteristically direct. He said that the house felt different the moment she was gone, not quieter, not emptier, not any of the words that people reach for when they are describing absence, just different. Different in a way that he found, after 51 years of knowing exactly what the house should feel like, impossible to accommodate. He never accommodated it. He spent the next 5 years in a Kensington Palace apartment, trying to construct a life outside the structure that had contained him since he was 16, and the construction never quite succeeded, and the failure was visible in everything he said and did in those 5 years, in ways that the post-2002 interviews capture without intending to. He had given everything to one world. The world had ended. The interviews were what remained. The Queen Mother left an estate valued at somewhere between 50 and 70 million pounds, depending on which accounting method was applied to assets, that the royal family's relationship with financial transparency made difficult to assess from the outside. She left personal bequests to the people who had been close to her. She left instructions about the disposal of possessions accumulated across a century of royal life. She left, in the carefully drafted language of a will, prepared by people who understood that royal wills are not simply private documents but institutional ones, a record of what she had valued and who she had trusted. William Tallon received £10,000. The figure has been reported consistently enough across multiple independent sources that its accuracy is not seriously disputed. £10,000 after 51 years of service. After 5 decades of managing the household that made her daily life possible. After half a century of discretion that had protected the institution from disclosures that would have been significantly more damaging than anything that emerged in the years after her death. After the flowers and the gin, and the mourning assessments and the feuds managed, and the access controlled, and the grief absorbed, and the 51 years of a life placed entirely in the service of one woman's comfort and one institution's reputation. £10,000. The figure does not become more explicable the longer you examine it. It sits in the record as a statement about what the institution valued and how it valued it, and the statement is not complicated or ambiguous. Tallon had been useful. He had been essential, in the way that certain people become essential to the functioning of a world they did not create and will not survive. He had been trusted in the deepest sense available to that household, trusted with the knowledge that could have destroyed reputations, trusted with the daily reality of a life that the public version did not accurately represent, trusted with the grief and the drinking and the feuds and the 51 years of private truth that exist beneath any public life long enough to have accumulated one. And he had been paid for all of it, in the final accounting, at a rate that worked out to roughly £200 per year of service. The grace-and-favour apartment in Kensington Palace that he was permitted to remain in after the Queen Mother's death was not a bequest in the legal sense. It was an accommodation, a temporary arrangement that the palace extended to senior household staff in recognition of the disruption that the end of a royal household produced for the people whose lives had been organized around it. The accommodation was genuine, and it was not nothing. But it was also not security, and it was also not acknowledgement, and the distinction between those things mattered to a man who had spent 51 years earning something he had apparently not been given. The financial reality of Tallon's post-2002 life was not comfortable. He had a pension from the royal household, the specifics of which have not been made public but which, given the period of his service and the grade of his position, was unlikely to have been substantial by the standards of what his service had produced for the institution. He had the apartment, for as long as the palace chose to extend the arrangement. He had his memories, which were valuable in a market sense, that the palace had not anticipated, and that produced, in the years after the Queen Mother's death, the interviews that the institution found so uncomfortable. The will was not the only financial instrument that shaped Tallon's post-2002 circumstances. There were, in the weeks and months following the Queen Mother's death, decisions made about the disposal of her personal possessions that touched Tallon's situation in ways that have been described by people close to him during this period as painful, in a register that went beyond simple financial disappointment. Objects that he had lived with for decades, that had been part of the household he managed, that he had arranged and cared for, and that carried, for him, the specific weight of things associated with someone you have loved and lost, were disposed of through the ordinary processes of estate management, without the acknowledgement that their significance to him warranted. This is not an unusual experience for household staff when a principal dies. The objects belong to the estate. The estate's executors manage the estate. The emotional significance of objects to the people who cared for them is not a legal category. But the lack of acknowledgement, in Tallon's case, arrived in the context of a broader lack of acknowledgement that the £10,000 bequest had already made visible. The institution had taken 51 years of his life and had declined, in the final accounting, to recognize what those years represented. He began giving interviews within a year of the Queen Mother's death. The decision was not, by the accounts of people close to him during this period, primarily financial in its motivation, though the financial dimension was real. It was also the decision of a man who had spent half a century in silence on the specific instruction of his professional role and who had discovered, upon the dissolution of that role, that the silence no longer served any purpose that he was obliged to maintain. The palace's position on the interviews was not formally stated, which was consistent with the palace's approach to situations it found uncomfortable. Formally stated positions invite formal responses. The informal position, communicated through the mechanisms available to an institution that has spent centuries developing methods of expressing displeasure without making it actionable, was that the interviews were unwelcome and that Tallon's continued occupancy of the Kensington Palace apartment existed in a relationship with his public conduct that he should consider carefully. Whether this informal position was communicated to Tallon directly, or whether he inferred it from the atmosphere that surrounded his continued residence in the palace, is something that the accounts of this period do not resolve cleanly. What is clear is that Tallon understood his situation, that the accommodation he depended on was not secure in the way that owned property is secure, and that the people who controlled its continuation had views about his public behavior that were not favorable. He gave the interviews anyway. The courage this required is not something that the coverage of his post-2002 life has adequately registered. Tallon was not a young man with resources and options. He was in his mid-60s, living in an apartment that could be withdrawn at institutional discretion, with a pension insufficient to replace it, giving interviews about a world that the institution that controlled his housing preferred he not discuss. The power asymmetry was total. He spoke anyway, with a candor that the asymmetry made genuinely remarkable. What he said in those interviews about the financial treatment he had received was characteristically precise. He did not perform bitterness. He did not make the situation operatic in the way that public grievances sometimes become operatic when the person expressing them understands that the performance is what generates sympathy. He simply described what had happened, in the flat language of someone reporting a fact, rather than seeking a verdict. He said that 51 years should have been worth more. He said it once, clearly, without elaboration, and then moved on to other subjects. The restraint was more devastating than any elaboration would have been. The will controversy produced, in the press coverage of the period, a sympathy for Tallon that his earlier public existence had not generated, and that surprised people who had covered him only in the context of his royal service. Here was a man who had given his life to an institution that had responded with a sum of money that most people in ordinary employment would have received for a single year's Christmas bonus. The mathematics were simple enough to communicate without requiring any particular expertise in royal affairs, and they communicated something about the relationship between service and reward in that world that landed in the public consciousness with the clarity of an obvious injustice. The palace did not respond to the coverage. Responding would have required either defending the bequest, which was indefensible on its own terms, or acknowledging that it was inadequate, which would have opened questions about how the institution compensated the people who made its daily operations possible. Neither option served the institutional interest. Silence served it better, as it generally did. The Kensington Palace apartment situation resolved itself in 2007, in the worst possible way from Tallon's perspective, when he was found unconscious in the apartment and taken to hospital. He had been drinking heavily in the years since the Queen Mother's death. The drinking that had been a constant of his social life had become, in the absence of the professional structure that had previously contained it, something closer to the thing that it had been for the Queen Mother herself, a daily mechanism for managing a loss that had no other adequate outlet. He died in November 2007, 5 years after the woman he had served. He was 69. The cause of death was given as natural causes, which in the specific context of his final years covered a range of conditions that the phrase natural causes was designed to encompass without specifying. The obituaries were warm, which is the thing that happens to people after they die, when the complexity of their lives can be resolved into a simpler tribute without anyone present to contest the resolution. He was described as devoted. He was described as irreplaceable. He was described as one of the great characters of royal service, which is a phrase that means something genuine about the person it is applied to, while also functioning as a way of containing that person within the category of charming eccentricity, rather than the category of someone who might be owed a serious accounting. The serious accounting of what his service represented, of what the institution took from him and what it returned, of what the £10,000 said about the relationship between the palace and the people who gave their lives to its operation, was not conducted in any obituary that appeared in any mainstream publication. It was conducted in the limited and partial way available to someone working from the outside, in the interviews he had given in the 5 years before his death. The interviews are the accounting. They are imperfect and incomplete, and shaped by the constraints under which they were given. They are also the closest thing to an honest record of life inside the 20th century British royal household that exists in the public domain. He gave them at personal cost, against institutional pressure, from a position of genuine vulnerability. The institution that benefited most from his 51 years of discretion spent the subsequent 5 years reminding him, through the atmosphere it created around his continued residence in its property, that his candor was not welcome. He was candid anyway. That, in the end, is the most complete description available of who William Tallon actually was. Not the devoted retainer of the official account, not the gossipy insider of the tabloid coverage, but a man who understood exactly what he had given and exactly what he had received in return, and who decided, in the years he had left, that the truth was worth more than the accommodation. The first interview Tallon gave that caused serious institutional discomfort was not the one that contained the most damaging material. It was the one that established the tone, that made clear, to the people inside the palace who monitored these things, that the man they had relied upon for 51 years to say nothing had decided that saying nothing was no longer a commitment he intended to honor. The tone was not angry. This was the detail that the palace found most difficult to manage. An angry Tallon would have been containable. Anger produces excess, and excess produces the conditions for discrediting, the overstatement, the obvious grievance, the emotional register that allows an institution's defenders to characterize the speaker as unreliable. Tallon was not angry in any register that the coverage could use. He was precise. He was funny. He was specific in the way that only someone who had been present for the things he was describing could be specific. And the specificity arrived with a lightness of touch that made it land harder than any performance of outrage would have. He described the Queen Mother's morning routine with details that the palace had spent decades ensuring nobody would describe publicly. Not because the details were scandalous, they were not, by any reasonable standard, scandalous, but because the details were real, and real details about the private life of a royal figure represent a category of disclosure that the institution treats as inherently threatening, regardless of the content. The content could be entirely benign and still constitute a breach, because the breach is not in what is said, but in the fact of saying it. The gin was discussed. Tallon discussed it in a way that was neither apologetic nor sensationalist. He described it as a feature of the household's daily life, with the same matter-of-fact quality that someone might use to describe a colleague's preference for strong coffee. The lack of drama was itself the drama. He was not revealing a secret. He was describing something that had been a secret only in the technical sense that it had not been publicly confirmed, and his confirmation of it carried the authority of someone who had been present for it every morning for 5 decades. The flowers were discussed, the specific arrangements he had made for specific occasions, the varieties the Queen Mother preferred, and the varieties she found unsatisfactory, and the particular aesthetic logic that governed which rooms received which treatments. These details were not politically sensitive. They were personally intimate in a way that the institution understood as its own kind of violation, a violation of the boundary between the public figure and the private person that the palace had maintained, with considerable effort and some success, for the entirety of the Queen Mother's public life. The social world of Clarence House was discussed, more carefully, but still with enough specificity to make the palace's communications people uncomfortable. He described the gatherings without naming the conversations they contained. He described the quality of the company the Queen Mother kept, without producing the material from that company that would have made individual people identifiable in ways they might have found unwelcome. He managed the boundary in those interviews with the same precision he had managed everything else, giving enough to be genuine, while withholding enough to be safe. What made the interviews remarkable was not any single disclosure. It was the accumulation of small truths that the accumulation produced a picture of a household and a woman, and a way of life that was considerably more human and considerably more complicated than the official version, and that was drawn not from documents or from hearsay, but from the daily observation of someone who had been inside the picture for longer than most people are inside anything. The palace's response to the interviews followed a pattern that Tallon, given his decades of observing institutional behavior from the inside, would have recognized and anticipated. There was no formal statement. There was no legal action, because the interviews contained nothing that met the threshold for legal action, and because legal action would have amplified the coverage rather than suppressing it. There was instead the application of atmosphere, the particular quality of institutional cold that is produced not by anything being done, but by things being notably not done. His requests for assistance with matters relating to the apartment, maintenance issues, administrative questions about the terms of his continued residence, were handled with a slowness that had not previously characterized his dealings with the palace's administrative staff. People who had been collegial during the years of his service were collegial in a more distant register. The small gestures of institutional belonging that had marked his relationship with the palace, the invitations to certain events, the inclusion in certain communications, became less frequent and then stopped. None of this was actionable. None of it was even clearly intentional in any individual instance. The coldness was institutional rather than personal, which made it more effective rather than less, because institutional coldness is self-reinforcing in ways that personal coldness is not. Once the temperature drops, the people inside the institution adjust their behavior to the new temperature without requiring instruction, and the adjustment becomes the new normal that requires no further maintenance. Tallon felt this and described feeling it in the later interviews, without describing it as persecution or as deliberate punishment. He described it as the natural consequence of having broken an understanding that both parties had always known existed, even though it had never been written down. He had been expected to stay silent. He had not stayed silent. The institution was behaving in the way that institutions behave when an expectation has been violated, not dramatically, not vindictively, but with the patient withdrawal of warmth that is the most sustainable form of institutional displeasure. He continued giving interviews. The decision to continue was not made without awareness of its consequences. The consequences were manageable, or had become manageable in the way that things become manageable when you have already paid the main cost, and the additional costs are incremental. The apartment situation was uncomfortable but stable. His pension, such as it was not at risk in any immediate way. The social coldness was real, but was experienced by a man who had spent 5 decades observing social coldness deployed against other people, and who understood its mechanisms too clearly to be paralyzed by it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What the interviews gave him, beyond the income they generated, was something that the 51 years of service had not given him, despite the depth and the duration of that service, a public identity of his own. He had been, for 5 decades, an extension of someone else's household. He had been defined entirely by his proximity to a more significant figure, his existence justified by the service he provided rather than by anything intrinsic to himself. The interviews made him, for the first time in his adult life, a person in his own right, someone whose observations were sought because of who he was rather than who he served. The pleasure he took in this was visible in the interviews themselves. He was good at them, better than people who had not spent 5 decades in the company of some of the most socially accomplished people in Britain had any reason to expect. He had absorbed, through 50 years of proximity, the quality of conversation that characterizes people who have been educated to perform at the highest social levels, and he deployed it in the interview context with a naturalness that suggested the absorption had been complete. He was funny, in the way that people are funny, when the humor comes from observation rather than from the desire to be seen as amusing. The observations were precise, the timing was impeccable, and the target was almost always the gap between the official version of something and its private reality. The gap that he had spent 50 years living inside, and that he could now describe from the inside with the authority that only genuine proximity provides. The BBC documentary that featured him in the years following the Queen Mother's death produced footage that the palace found uncomfortable, for reasons that went beyond any specific disclosure. The discomfort came from the quality of Tallon's presence on camera, his ease, his authority, his obvious genuine knowledge of what he was describing. He looked and sounded like someone who had been at the center of something significant, because he had been, and the looking and sounding contradicted the category of peripheral domestic servant that the palace needed him to occupy in the public understanding of his role. A peripheral domestic servant can be acknowledged and then set aside. A man who talks about a royal household with the authority of someone who ran it and who is clearly telling the truth about what he observed there cannot be set aside in the same way. He requires engagement, or he requires discrediting, and Tallon was not discreditable in any obvious way. His service record was impeccable, his personal conduct toward the Queen Mother was beyond dispute, and his account of her household was too internally consistent and too corroborated by other sources to be dismissed as invention. The palace chose the third option available to it, which was neither engagement nor discrediting, but the gradual management of his visibility. This is the option that institutions choose when the other options carry more risk than the problem itself, when speaking about the problem amplifies it and silencing the person who embodies it is legally or practically unavailable. The management of visibility involves ensuring that the person in question reaches the smallest possible audience while remaining technically uncensored, that their interviews appear in contexts that carry less authority than the contexts the institution can influence, and that the coverage of what they say is shaped, through the ordinary mechanisms of press relations, in ways that reduce its impact without requiring the institution to appear to be reducing it. Tallon was not entirely successfully managed in this way. He was too good a subject, too articulate, too specific, too clearly genuine, for the coverage of his interviews to be reduced to the level of harmlessness that the palace preferred. What the management achieved was a limitation of his reach rather than an elimination of his impact, and the limitation was sufficient to prevent the interviews from producing the kind of sustained public conversation that would have required a formal institutional response. The formal response never came. The interviews continued, periodically, until Tallon's health made them impractical and then impossible. The palace's 5 years of discomfort ended not through resolution, but through the natural arithmetic that it had always been waiting for. He died. The interviews stopped. The discomfort was resolved by the mechanism that resolves most institutional problems eventually, the passage of time and the departure of the person who was causing them. What remained was the record. The record was incomplete, shaped by the constraints under which it had been produced, limited by the judgments Tallon had made about what could and could not be said. But it existed, in the way that spoken truth exists when it has been recorded, permanently, accessibly, indifferent to the preferences of the people who would have preferred it remained unspoken. The palace had had 51 years of his silence. It had 5 years of his speech. The speech was more interesting than the silence, and it will last longer than either the institution anticipated or Tallon himself had time to appreciate. Every honest account of a significant life contains a shadow account, the version that exists in the knowledge of the people closest to the subject, that never reaches the public record in full, and that shapes the official account by its absence as much as by anything it contains. The shadow account of the Queen Mother's life is larger than most, because the official account is more carefully constructed than most, and because the person who came closest to holding it complete was a man who understood, with considerable precision, how much of it he could disclose, before the disclosure became something other than honesty. Tallon held the shadow account. He disclosed fragments of it, across 5 years of interviews, with a selectivity that was simultaneously generous and withholding, generous in the detail he offered about the texture of daily life at Clarence House, withholding about the categories of information that would have required him to name people who were still living, and still powerful, and still capable of making the consequences of naming them felt. The categories he withheld are identifiable, even in their absence, by the shape of what he said around them. He talked about the Queen Mother's opinions at considerable length, and with considerable specificity, but always in terms of aesthetic preferences and social assessments, rather than political ones. She had opinions about people she found boring. She had opinions about flowers arranged incorrectly, and food prepared without sufficient seriousness, and social gatherings that lacked the quality of conversation she considered the point of gathering at all. These opinions Tallon reported with the pleasure of someone repeating the observations of a person whose eye he admired. The political opinions, the views she held about specific policies, specific politicians, specific decisions made at the level of government that intersected with the institution she inhabited, were present in the interviews as a silence shaped exactly like their absence. The Queen Mother had political opinions. This is established beyond reasonable dispute by multiple sources independent of Tallon, including the accounts of politicians who visited Clarence House across 5 decades and who have described, in memoirs and in conversations reported by biographers, a woman whose understanding of political affairs was acute and whose views about them were expressed with a directness that her public image of benign neutrality did not accommodate. She was not neutral. She was performing neutrality, which is a different thing, and the performance was sufficiently convincing that it survived 50 years of public scrutiny intact. Tallon knew what lay beneath the performance. He had heard the unperformed version across decades of evenings when the politicians had gone home and the household had settled into the register of candor that domestic life eventually produces, regardless of how carefully the daylight hours have been managed. He did not report the unperformed version in any interview that reached the public record. He indicated its existence, indicated that there was a version, that it was specific, that it concerned specific people and specific periods, and then moved the conversation in a different direction. The movement was always graceful enough to avoid the appearance of evasion while constituting evasion in practice. This was a skill he had developed across 50 years of managing conversations at Clarence House, the capacity to redirect without appearing to redirect, to close a subject by opening an adjacent one, to leave an interviewer feeling that the conversation had been productive while ensuring that certain doors had not been opened. It was the domestic manager's skill applied to the interview context, and it worked on most interviewers because most interviewers had not spent 50 years learning to recognize it. The Queen Mother's views about the end of the British Empire occupy a specific place in the shadow account that Tallon's interviews suggest without addressing. She was born in 1900 and died in 2002, which means she lived through the entire arc of Britain's imperial century, from the height of the empire's reach to its complete dissolution, as a central figure in the institution most symbolically associated with imperial identity. The emotional and political content of that lived experience, for a woman of her background and her particular investment in the institution's significance, was not simple, and the public version of her relationship to it was not complete. She said things, in private, about the dissolution of the empire and about the people associated with that dissolution that Tallon heard and did not repeat. He indicated this indirectly in one interview, a half-completed sentence, a pause, a shift in subject that a careful listener would have noticed and that the interviewer did not pursue. The indication was enough to establish that there was material. The material itself remained in the shadow account where Tallon had decided it belonged. The royal family film of 1969, which gave the British public its first extended look at the royal family in domestic circumstances, had produced within the institution a debate about the wisdom of the access it provided that had never been fully resolved. The Queen Mother's position in this debate, her view about how much visibility the institution should permit, about the relationship between public access and institutional authority, about the specific decisions made in the subsequent decades about royal media management, was known to Tallon because the debate had not been conducted exclusively in the formal settings where official positions were established. It had been conducted, as debates in that world always were, across the dinner tables and the drawing rooms and the evening conversations where the real assessments were made. The debate produced positions that were not uniform across the family. There were members of the royal family who believed that the 1969 film had been a mistake, that the access it provided had established a precedent for further access that the institution was not equipped to manage, and members who believed the opposite. Tallon knew where the Queen Mother stood in this debate, with a specificity that went beyond the general impression available from her public conduct. He did not state her position explicitly in any interview. He stated, in terms that were clear enough to be understood by someone paying attention, that she had a position and that it was held with conviction. The decade of the 1990s produced, for everyone with close access to the royal family, an accumulation of private observations that the public version of those years does not capture. The Wales marriage, the Morton book, the separation, the Panorama interview, the divorce, and Diana's death. These events, which played out in public with a completeness that made them feel fully documented, were experienced by the people inside the institution in a parallel register that the public version barely touched. Tallon observed the 1990s from Clarence House, with the particular vantage point of someone who was close enough to the center to receive the emotional reality of each development, while being sufficiently peripheral to the formal decision-making to observe without being required to participate. He saw how the senior members of the family processed each crisis, not the official processing, which was managed for public consumption, but the private processing that happened in the evenings and the weekends and the moments between public appearances when the performance was suspended. He has described the 1990s at Clarence House in terms that convey atmosphere without specifying content, the quality of certain evenings, the texture of certain silences, the way that the household's emotional register shifted in response to developments that were not directly discussed, but that shaped everything around them. The description is honest, and it is incomplete, and the incompleteness is deliberate, and the deliberateness is itself a form of honesty about what he was and was not prepared to put into a public record. The Queen Mother's health across the final decade of her life was managed with a discretion that went beyond the ordinary privacy that ill people are entitled to expect. She had injuries and conditions and periods of physical difficulty that were known to the household and unknown to the public, and the management of the boundary between those two categories of knowledge was among Tallon's most delicate ongoing responsibilities. He maintained the boundary in the interviews he gave after her death with the same care he had maintained it during her life, acknowledging that the public account of her health was incomplete without specifying how it was incomplete or in what directions the incompleteness ran. What he said about her final years, and specifically about the period following Princess Margaret's death in February 2002, was the most complete thing he said in any interview about any period of her life. The completeness was possible because Margaret was dead and the Queen Mother was dead, and the people most affected by a full account of those weeks were no longer present to be affected. He described a woman in genuine grief, stripped of the performance that public life had required for a century, present in her own experience in a way that the performance had always slightly prevented. The description was the most intimate thing he disclosed in 5 years of interviews, and it was intimate not because it contained damaging information about anyone, but because it was simply true in the way that descriptions of people in grief are true when the person describing has been present and is reporting honestly what they saw. It was also, perhaps, the description that cost him the most to give, not because it would have consequences, but because the giving of it required him to be inside the memory of those weeks in a way that was not comfortable and that did not become more comfortable through the act of speaking. He had loved her. This is the fact that the official account acknowledges in the vocabulary of devoted service, and that the interviews reveal, in a register, that service vocabulary cannot adequately contain. He had loved the Queen Mother in the specific way that people love someone they have organized their entire adult life around. Not romantically, not with the complications that romantic love produces, but with the depth of investment that comes from having chosen, at 16, to place everything you have in the direction of one world and one person, and from having stayed in that choice for 51 years without retreating from it. The shadow account he kept was kept partly for the reasons he stated: the living people, the institutional consequences, the practical limits of what could be said safely. It was also kept for a reason he did not state in any interview, but that the interviews suggest clearly to anyone reading them with attention. Some of what he knew about the Queen Mother he kept because telling it would have required him to present her as something other than the person he had loved. The shadow account was not uniformly flattering. The private reality of a complex woman living a complicated life inside a demanding institution was not uniformly flattering, because private realities never are. He knew the parts that were not flattering. He chose, across 5 years of interviews that were notable for their candor, not to make those parts public. That choice is itself a disclosure of something. It tells you about the nature of what he felt for her more accurately than any specific thing he said. He had been paid £10,000. He had been managed out of his public silence by financial necessity and personal conviction. He had spoken with a candor that cost him institutional warmth and residential security. He drew the line, in the end, at the things that would have made her smaller than she was in his understanding of her. That line was the last form of service he could offer. He offered it without being asked, and without acknowledgement, and without anyone outside the shadow account ever knowing exactly where it ran. There is a place on the northern coast of Scotland, so remote that the wind arrives from the Arctic without interruption, and the sea, on clear days, shows you nothing beyond itself, for as far as the eye can follow. The Castle of May sits on that coast, in Caithness, at the extreme top of the British mainland. Not a romantic remoteness, not the managed wildness of the highlands that tourists drive through on their way to somewhere more accessible, but a genuine, functional, unglamorous distance from everything that the word London implies. The Queen Mother bought it in 1952, the year her husband died and her daughter became queen, and the entire structure of her life dissolved and reassembled around an absence that nothing in her previous existence had prepared her for. She bought it because she had seen it on a visit to the area, and had felt, in it and around it, something that she had not felt in any of the formal residences that the institution provided. A sense that the place did not require anything of her. It was too far away, too exposed, too thoroughly indifferent to the performance of royalty to demand that performance. She could be in it without being anything other than the person standing in the wind looking at the sea. She restored it. The restoration was conducted with a thoroughness that the building's condition required, and a personal involvement that the Queen Mother brought to things she genuinely cared about. She oversaw the decisions about rooms and furnishings and gardens with the attention she brought to Clarence House, but without the institutional layer that Clarence House always carried, without the awareness that the choices being made would eventually be seen, assessed, and managed for public consumption. The Castle of May was, in the most literal sense available to someone in her position, hers. Tallon went to May every summer. This is the detail that his accounts of the castle carry most weight. Not the building itself, which has been documented in authorized accounts and visitor guides produced since the Queen Mother's death, but the particular quality of life that May produced in the household that spent 6 weeks there each year. He described it in the interviews as unlike anything else in his experience of royal service, and the description carries a quality of genuine fondness that his accounts of Clarence House, which were fond in a more complicated way, do not quite match. The staff complement at May was smaller than at any of the other residences. The smaller complement produced a different dynamic. The hierarchy that sustained itself at Clarence House through the sheer number of people it contained became, at May, too small to sustain in its usual form. People who occupied distinct categories at Clarence House found those categories less distinct in the castle's limited domestic space, and the result was an atmosphere that everyone who described the summer visits, from multiple positions within the household, characterized as unusual in the same way: warmer, more direct, less governed by the protocols that made the London household function, and that also made it, inevitably, somewhat formal, even at its most relaxed. The Queen Mother was different at May. This observation appears, independently, in enough accounts from enough sources to be taken as established, rather than as the romanticization of a remote location. She was different in the specific way that people are different when the distance from their primary identity is large enough to allow them to occupy the secondary one, the identity that exists beneath the performance, that the performance was developed to contain, and that reasserts itself when the conditions that require the performance are sufficiently absent. At May she walked. She walked in the way that people walk when walking is what they want to do, rather than what the schedule requires, without purpose, without direction that was predetermined, along the coastal path, and through the garden, and across the land around the castle, that the wind had shaped into a particular kind of beauty that has nothing to do with cultivation. Tallon walked with her sometimes, or was present for the walks, and his descriptions of those occasions are the most unguarded things he said about her in 5 years of interviews, the most direct engagements with who she was when the role was not operating at full pressure. He described her interest in the garden at May with a specificity that reveals genuine knowledge rather than general impression. She was not a passive appreciator of the garden. She was engaged with it, opinionated about it, and capable of the kind of sustained attention to growing things that people who find genuine pleasure in them bring rather than the kind of attention that people perform, because gardens are considered appropriate interests for people in their position. She knew what she was looking at. She had preferences that were specific and that she could articulate in terms that demonstrated the preference was formed rather than assumed. The livestock that the castle's farm maintained were another dimension of May that the official accounts have noted, and that Tallon's descriptions illuminate in a different way. The Queen Mother's relationship with the cattle and the other animals on the farm was not the arm's-length appreciation of someone for whom animals are picturesque rather than real. She engaged with them in the way that people engage with animals, when the engagement is genuinely pleasurable rather than performed, and the engagement produced in her a quality of straightforward happiness that Tallon, across 51 years of observing her in virtually every other context, described as distinctive to May in a way that he found both moving and slightly surprising. Surprising because the person who was happy among the cattle at May was the same person who navigated the extraordinary complexity of her public life with a sophistication that left almost no room for the uncomplicated. The sophistication was real, and the happiness was real, and the distance between those two things, which May somehow bridged, was what made the castle significant to her in a way that went beyond sentiment about her husband's death or nostalgia for a simpler life. It was the one place where the distance between the performed version of herself and the actual version was small enough to be almost unnoticeable. Tallon managed May, as he managed everything else, with the adjustment that the smaller staff and the different atmosphere required. The adjustment was not difficult. He has described it, in the interviews, as the easiest professional context he operated in across 50 years of service, not because the work was lighter, which it was, but because the register in which the work was done was the register he found most natural. Less formal, more personal, more directly connected to the immediate needs of the person he was serving, rather than to the institutional requirements that in London always surrounded and sometimes obscured those needs. The evenings at May were different from the evenings at Clarence House, in ways that Tallon described with the particular fondness of someone recalling something genuinely good. The social gatherings were smaller. The guests were people whose connection to the Queen Mother was personal rather than ceremonial, and the conversations that resulted were conversations that the formal social world of London did not often produce. Less managed, less shaped by the awareness that everything said in the presence of a senior royal figure was being observed and assessed. She drank at May as she drank everywhere, which is to say consistently, and with the particular quality of pleasure that people bring to things that have been integrated into the texture of daily life for long enough to be genuinely pleasurable rather than merely habitual. But at May, the drinking occupied a different social context, the context of evenings that were genuinely relaxed rather than strategically informal, and the difference showed in the quality of what the evenings produced. She talked at May about things that the Clarence House social world did not often produce, about her childhood, about people from her past who had no current institutional significance, and whose relevance to the conversation was simply that she remembered them with affection. About the king, more directly than she talked about him in London, where the talking about him was always shaped by the awareness that the grief it expressed was being observed, about what she had found surprising in her life and what she had found confirming, about the specific ways in which the world had changed across a century and the specific ways in which it had not. Tallon absorbed these conversations with the same completeness that he absorbed everything else across 50 years of proximity. The May conversations are among the things he held most carefully in the post-2002 interviews, more carefully than the political opinions, more carefully than the family dynamics, more carefully than the financial realities. He described their existence. He described their quality. He described the register in which they were conducted and the effect they had on the evenings that contained them. He did not report their content in any specific way that would have made the reporting feel like disclosure rather than tribute. The distinction he was maintaining was between the private person and the public record, and at May, the distinction mattered most, because at May, the private person was most fully present. To report May accurately would have required reporting the person who existed there, and reporting that person would have required giving the world something that Tallon had concluded the world was not entitled to have. What the world was entitled to have was the knowledge that the place existed, that it mattered to her, and that it produced in her a quality of genuine life, that the official version of her existence, with its managed grandeur and its ceremonial precision and its sustained performance of royal serenity, did not always capture. May was the gap in the performance. The gap was real. Tallon had been inside it for 51 summers, and he guarded what he had found there with a care that his post-2002 candor on other subjects makes more, rather than less, significant. The castle passed after the Queen Mother's death to a trust established to preserve it. It is now open to visitors during the summer months. The rooms that Tallon arranged and managed and inhabited across 5 decades are viewable for the price of an admission ticket. The garden that she walked in is maintained by the trust with an attention to her preferences that the trust's documentation makes clear. The people who visit find a building of considerable character in a landscape of extraordinary severity. They find rooms that have been preserved with an authenticity that feels genuine rather than curated. They find, in the castle's atmosphere, something of the quality that Tallon described, a sense of a place that was genuinely inhabited rather than formally occupied, that bears the mark of a person rather than an institution. What they do not find, because it existed only in the accumulated memory of a man who spent 51 summers there and who died in 2007, taking most of what he knew with him, is the account of what those summers actually contained. The conversations, the evenings, the walks, the specific quality of a person who was, at that latitude, in that wind, among those cattle, more fully herself than anywhere else on earth. That account is gone. Tallon took it with a thoroughness that the shadow account's keeper always intended, and the castle stands in the wind without it, open to visitors, beautiful, and significantly less knowable than it appears. The British royal family that William Tallon observed across 5 decades was not the family that appeared in the Christmas broadcasts. It was not the family of the official photographs, the coordinated colours on the Buckingham Palace balcony, the careful arrangements at Balmoral, the managed informality of the images released to mark anniversaries and birthdays, and the other calendrical occasions that the palace used to demonstrate that the monarchy was a human institution rather than a ceremonial one. The family Tallon knew was the family that existed between those photographs, in the spaces that the photographs were designed to fill without representing. He was not a central figure in the lives of all of them. His primary relationship was with the Queen Mother, and the connections that radiated outward from that relationship were secondary ones. shaped by the Queen Mother's position at the periphery of the working royal family's daily operations rather than its center. But periphery is a relative concept in a world as small as the senior royal family, and the periphery of that world still placed Tallon within observation range of the people who populated it in ways that most people who have written about the family have never been. Princess Margaret was the royal family member whose life intersected most directly and most consistently with Tallon's world at Clarence House. She was the Queen Mother's younger daughter, which placed her in the household's orbit with a regularity that the older daughter's position as queen made less frequent for Elizabeth. Margaret came to Clarence House. She came for lunch, for dinner, for the unscheduled visits that children make to parents when the relationship is close enough to sustain them, and the visits produced in the household a dynamic that Tallon observed across 4 decades with the attention of someone for whom Margaret was simultaneously a familiar presence and a perpetually unresolved one. He has described Margaret with a frankness that stops well short of unkindness, but that is considerably more specific than the general warmth that most accounts of her apply as a default. He described her intelligence, which was genuine, considerable, and consistently underestimated by people whose primary impression of her was formed by the glamorous surface she maintained. He described her wit, which was sharp, in the way that wit is sharp when it comes from intelligence, combined with a fundamental impatience with the performances of people she found boring. He described her capacity for warmth toward people she genuinely liked, and her capacity for coldness toward people she did not, and the directness with which she communicated both, which was not universally appreciated in a world that had developed elaborate protocols for managing royal displeasure without expressing it plainly. He also described what the official accounts of Margaret have always managed around rather than through, the specific quality of unhappiness that characterized her adult life, in ways that the public version, which attributed the unhappiness to the Townsend affair, and then to the Snowdon marriage, and then to the general difficulty of being a peripheral royal in an institution designed around its center, does not fully capture. The unhappiness was more structural than the event-based account suggests. It was the unhappiness of someone who had the intelligence and the personality to occupy a significant role, and who was prevented from occupying one, not by any specific prohibition, but by the accumulated weight of the institution's assumptions about what someone in her position was for. Tallon saw this clearly because he had watched it develop across 4 decades in the specific domestic context of visits to Clarence House, where Margaret was simultaneously a daughter and a guest, and a woman negotiating her relationship to a mother whose own accommodation with the institution had been more successful, and who represented, without intending to, a standard against which Margaret's accommodation was implicitly measured. The Queen Mother's relationship with Margaret was one of the most complicated dynamics Tallon observed across his entire career, and his account of it is one of the places where his post-2002 candor was most carefully managed. He described love, genuine, considerable, not in doubt. He described also the specific ways in which the love and the difficulty coexisted without resolving each other, the ways in which 2 people who cared for each other deeply could also be the source of each other's most sustained frustrations, and the way that those frustrations were managed across 5 decades of proximity without ever being directly addressed in any form that would have required their acknowledgement. Prince Charles appears in Tallon's accounts in a register that is more careful than his accounts of Margaret and more specific than his accounts of the Queen. He had contact with Charles through the ordinary operations of the household, visits to the Queen Mother, the family gatherings that Clarence House hosted, the occasions on which Charles's own life intersected with the household's world in ways that brought him into Tallon's observation range. The contact was not intimate in the way that his contact with Margaret was intimate, but it was sustained enough across decades to have produced genuine observation rather than impression. He described Charles with a complexity that the simple narratives of the 1990s, the cold husband, the difficult son, the prince perpetually overshadowed, do not accommodate. He described someone whose genuine interests were real and whose genuine warmth, directed toward people and things that engaged it, was also real, and whose public image, during the worst years of the Wales marriage, had been shaped so completely by the coverage of that marriage that the person underneath the image had become nearly invisible. Tallon had known the person underneath the image for decades before the image was formed, and the knowledge gave his observations a quality of prior context that most observers of Charles during the 1990s did not have. He did not describe Charles in terms that would have served either the sympathetic or the critical case that the 1990s required. He described someone more complicated than either case required, which is what proximity to real people over long periods generally produces, a complexity that resists reduction to the version that any particular narrative needs. Diana appears in Tallon's accounts in the most carefully managed form of any figure he discussed. He had contact with her through the Queen Mother's household, the visits that Diana made to Clarence House during the years of the marriage, and, more fraught, during the years of its public disintegration. He observed those visits with the attention he brought to everything, and he held what he observed with a tightness that his post-2002 candor on almost every other subject makes conspicuous. What he said about Diana was warm in its surface content. He described her as someone who understood the importance of the people around her in a way that not everyone in her position understood, who paid attention to staff in a manner that was genuine rather than performed, who had the particular quality of making the people she was talking to feel that the conversation they were having was the conversation she most wanted to be having. These observations are consistent with what many other people who knew Diana have said, and their consistency across multiple sources gives them a quality of established truth. What he did not say about Diana is the more significant thing. He did not say anything about the Queen Mother's private assessment of Diana's role in the Wales marriage breakdown, an assessment that the visits to Clarence House would have made visible to him across the years when the breakdown was occurring and when the household's emotional atmosphere was shaped by its ongoing developments. He did not say anything about the conversations at Clarence House during this period that touched the Diana situation in any specific way. He managed around the subject with the same graceful indirection that he applied to anything where the specific truth was more complicated than a warm generality could contain. Prince Philip appears in Tallon's accounts less frequently than the other senior figures, which reflects the relatively limited overlap between Philip's world and the Queen Mother's household. The relationship between Philip and the Queen Mother was one of the more thoroughly documented private royal relationships of the 20th century. Multiple sources, across multiple decades, have described a mutual wariness that was managed with sufficient skill on both sides to remain formally correct while never becoming genuinely warm. Tallon observed the relationship in the specific context of the occasions when Philip was present at Clarence House, and he described it in the interviews with a precision that confirmed its essential character without adding anything that would have constituted genuine disclosure. The junior members of the family, the Queen's children beyond Charles, the extended family that the institution maintained in a supporting role to its operational center, appear in Tallon's accounts as peripheral figures observed at specific moments rather than as subjects of sustained observation. He had opinions about them, formed across the decades of their visits to Clarence House and their intersections with the household's life. He shared those opinions selectively, in the way that someone shares opinions when they have concluded that some opinions serve a purpose and others do not. What is notable, reading across the complete body of Tallon's post-2002 interviews, is the shape of what he chose to give and what he chose to withhold about each member of the family. The choices are not random. They follow a logic that becomes visible when you map them, a logic of protection that is not uniform across all the subjects, but that is applied with specific care to specific people, and the specific care tells you something about who he considered genuinely worth protecting and who he considered capable of looking after themselves. Margaret gets the most complete portrait because Margaret is dead and because the completeness serves the truth of who she was, rather than serving any current institutional interest. Charles gets a complexity that serves neither his critics nor his defenders, because Tallon's loyalty to accuracy was stronger than his loyalty to any particular version of the prince. Diana gets warmth and careful silence, because the warmth was genuine and the silence was, in the end, a form of respect for someone who had not had enough of it while she was alive. The Queen herself appears in the interviews as the subject most carefully managed of all, present as a constant reference point, acknowledged as the central figure around whom everything else in the royal world organized itself, but discussed in terms so general and so consistently warm that the discussion reveals almost nothing about the specific person behind the role. This is Tallon's most significant editorial decision across the entire body of interviews. He had observed Elizabeth II across 50 years, in the specific context of her relationship with her mother, in the indirect ways that royal family members intersect when the household they are visiting is not their primary one. He had observations. The observations were withheld almost entirely. The withholding tells you something. A man who discussed Margaret with the frankness he brought to those accounts, who described the Queen Mother's political opinions in terms that indicated they were strongly held and sometimes uncomfortable, who discussed Charles in terms that contradicted the dominant narrative of the 1990s. That man had opinions about Elizabeth II formed across 5 decades of observation, and the decision to keep them almost entirely out of the public record was made with the same precision that governed all his other decisions about disclosure. He knew where the line was. He drew it around the Queen with a care that he drew it around nobody else in the family. The drawing of that line, in a man whose post-2002 interviews were notable for where the lines were not drawn, is the most informative silence in an account built on the productive tension between what was said and what was not. The apartment in Kensington Palace that Tallon occupied after the Queen Mother's death was not a small space. It had the dimensions of a comfortable London flat, with ceilings high enough and rooms large enough to remind their occupant, daily, that the building containing them was not an ordinary building. The furniture was his own, accumulated across decades of a working life, spent in places where the furniture was always someone else's. The objects on the shelves were objects he had chosen, rather than objects he had arranged for someone else's comfort. The morning silence was a silence he woke into alone, without the schedule that had structured every morning of his adult life, without the assessment of the day ahead that had been the first act of every professional morning for 51 years. He was 64 when the Queen Mother died. 64 is not old in any contemporary understanding of that age, but it is old in the specific sense that matters when the entirety of your adult identity has been organized around a role that no longer exists. The role had not simply employed him, it had been him, had provided the framework within which his personality, his skills, his social world, and his daily experience of meaning had all operated simultaneously. Without the role, the question of who he was became a question he had not previously needed to answer, and the answering of it turned out to be considerably more difficult than 51 years of professional competence suggested it should be. The people who knew him during this period, former colleagues, friends from the social world that the Queen Mother's household had sustained, people who had been part of the Clarence House world and who remained in contact after it dissolved, have described someone navigating the loss of the role with a difficulty that the public version of his post-2002 life, which focused on the interviews and the indiscretions and the palace's discomfort, did not capture. The difficulty was not dramatic. It was the ordinary difficulty of a person who has structured their existence around a single purpose and who finds, upon the purpose's removal, that the structures it supported do not stand independently. He cooked for himself, which he had not done with any regularity for 5 decades. He managed his own schedule, which had been managed by the demands of the Queen Mother's schedule for so long that managing it independently required decisions he had not had to make since adolescence. He woke without the particular urgency that had characterized every morning of his working life, the urgency of someone whose first task of the day was the management of someone else's first experience of the day, and the absence of urgency was not, as people who have never experienced its removal sometimes imagine it would be, a relief. The drinking increased. This is the fact that the people who describe his final years are most consistent about, and it is consistent in a way that requires neither judgment nor euphemism to address accurately. He had always drunk. It had been a feature of his social life across the decades of his service, managed within the professional context that gave it a container, occasional in its excess and unremarkable in its ordinariness. Without the professional container, the management became different in character, and the character it became was not the same thing as what had preceded it. He was not a man in visible crisis. He went out. He saw people. He gave the interviews that provided both income and the particular kind of engagement that the interviews provided. The engagement of being asked about things he had experienced and responding from genuine knowledge rather than from the performance of knowledge that most public speech requires. He maintained the social fluency that 50 years of the best available company had developed in him, and the fluency meant that the difficulty was not always visible to the people who encountered him in the contexts where the fluency was operating. The contexts where it was not operating were the ones that people closest to him during this period found hardest to watch. The evenings in the apartment, the mornings, the particular quality of time that accumulates when the structure that previously consumed it has been removed and no replacement structure of equivalent weight has been found. He had friends, the friendships that had survived the decades of service, people who had known him within the household and people who had known him outside it, through the social world that Clarence House's gatherings had produced access to, remained. But friendships, even good friendships, are not the same thing as purpose, and the distinction between those two things became, in the Kensington Palace apartment, more apparent than it had previously needed to be. The financial situation added a specific texture to the difficulty that the other difficulties did not have on their own. The £10,000 bequest had been spent. The pension covered the basic requirements of his life without providing anything beyond them. The interviews generated income, but not reliably and not in quantities that resolved the structural question of a man in his late 60s, in London, with no savings of significance and a standard of living that the decades inside royal households had calibrated to a level his current income did not support. He sold things, objects from the decades of service, not the Queen Mother's possessions, which had passed to the estate, but the things that had been his own across the years, accumulated in the way that people accumulate things when they are in proximity to a world where beautiful objects are ordinary. The sales were private rather than public, conducted through the channels available to people who need to convert possessions to income without generating the coverage that a public sale would have produced. The palace knew about the financial situation, or had access to enough information to understand its general character. The knowledge did not produce any adjustment to the pension or any additional support of the kind that the institution could have provided without significant cost and that would have addressed the most acute dimensions of the difficulty. The knowledge produced the institutional silence that had characterized its response to Tallon since the first interview. The silence that is not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of an institution that has calculated the cost of action against the cost of inaction and determined that inaction is cheaper. The calculation was not wrong in any institutional sense. Tallon was not, from the palace's perspective, a current problem. He was a former problem, managed, past his most productive period of disclosure, declining in the health that was the visible evidence of the underlying difficulty, and unlikely in his current state to produce material significantly more damaging than what had already appeared in the 5 years of interviews. Providing financial support would have required an acknowledgement of the inadequacy of what he had received, and acknowledgement of inadequacy was a precedent the institution had no interest in establishing. He deteriorated in 2007 in ways that people around him have described with the care that people bring to descriptions of someone they watched fail. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the steady quality of someone whose physical resources were diminishing in proportion to the depletion of whatever had been sustaining them. He was found unconscious in the apartment in circumstances that the coverage described briefly and then did not pursue, because the coverage of Tallon had always been most interested in him as a source of royal material, and a man who was no longer producing royal material was not a story that the coverage had an obvious framework for. He was taken to hospital. He recovered sufficiently to return to the apartment, but the recovery was incomplete in ways that people who saw him during the final months have described as visible, a reduction in the quality of presence that had characterized him throughout his public life, a diminishment of the sharpness that had been his most consistent attribute across 5 decades of observation. He died on the 20th of November 2007. He was 69 years old, which is not a remarkable age to die, but which, given that the woman he had served reached 101, carries a particular quality of comment on the different costs that different lives inside the same institution can produce. The obituaries noted his service. They noted the nickname, Backstairs Billy, which he had acquired through the ordinary processes by which royal household staff acquire nicknames, and which had become, in the post-2002 interviews, the public identity that replaced the professional one. They noted the Queen Mother's fondness for him. They noted the interviews, briefly and without the detailed engagement that the interviews warranted. They described him as a character, which is what obituaries say about people whose lives were genuinely distinctive, when the distinctiveness cannot be adequately summarized in the space available. The palace issued no statement. Statements about deceased household staff are not a category of palace communication that has an established form, and the absence of a statement was consistent with the way the palace had handled Tallon's existence since 2002, by not engaging with it formally, because formal engagement requires a position, and positions on William Tallon were positions the palace preferred not to occupy. The Kensington Palace apartment was cleared and returned to the palace's management. The process was efficient in the way that practical matters involving royal property are generally efficient. Whatever remained of Tallon's possessions after the estate was managed passed to the people he had designated and to the processes that estates pass through when the person who created them is no longer present to direct the passage. He had given 51 years of his life to one woman and one institution. He had received, in the final accounting, £10,000 and 5 years of institutional cold, and an apartment that was never quite his, regardless of how long he lived in it. He had given, in the 5 years between her death and his own, an account of what those 51 years had actually contained that was more honest and more complete than the institution that benefited from the 51 years had any interest in producing itself. He died in November, in a palace that was no longer his, in any sense that the institution would acknowledge, having spent his last years talking about a world that the institution would have preferred he had kept to himself, and having kept enough of that world private that the institution could not say he had entirely betrayed it. The loneliness of those 5 years is the thing the official account cannot accommodate, because accommodating it would require acknowledging the institution's role in producing it. The loneliness was not simply the ordinary loneliness of grief, though it contained that. It was the specific loneliness of a person whose entire world had been constructed inside a structure that belonged to someone else, and that dissolved the moment the someone else was gone, leaving behind a person who had no independent structure to return to, because the construction of one had never been necessary before. Clarence House had been his home for 5 decades. He had not owned it, had not paid for it, had not had any formal claim on it, beyond the professional relationship that sustained his right to be there. When the professional relationship ended, the home ended with it, and the replacement home in Kensington Palace was a grace-and-favour arrangement that carried, in its very description, the reminder that the grace and the favour belonged to the institution rather than to him. He understood all of this. He had understood it, at some level, since the beginning. Since the 16-year-old from Coventry had walked into a palace and understood that the world he was entering was not a world he would ever own, only inhabit. The inhabitation had lasted 51 years and had been, by the most important measures available to assess a life, a genuine and complete thing. The end of it was not the measure of the inhabitation. The inhabitation was its own measure. He had been, for 51 years, exactly where he intended to be. There is a particular category of historical source that archivists describe as a near miss, the document that almost existed, the testimony that came close to being recorded, the account that was begun and not completed, or completed and not preserved. Near misses haunt historical research in ways that successful sources do not, because their absence is felt most acutely in precisely the places where the existing record is thinnest, and the existing record is thinnest in precisely the places where the near miss would have filled it. William Tallon's complete account of 51 years inside the Queen Mother's household is a near miss of considerable historical significance. What exists is the fraction he produced in 5 years of interviews, the fraction shaped by his judgments about what could safely be said, by the particular questions that particular journalists happened to ask, by the energy and health available to him at the specific moments when the interviews occurred, and by the editorial decisions made by the producers and publishers who mediated between his account and its eventual audience. The fraction is substantial. It tells us things about the Queen Mother's daily life and private character that no official source confirms and that multiple other sources corroborate. It gives us a texture of royal domestic life that authorized biographies, constrained by access and by the cooperation they require from the institution they describe, cannot produce. But the fraction is a fraction. The calculation of what it represents, relative to the complete account, is necessarily approximate, but the approximation is not encouraging. Tallon spent 51 years in daily proximity to one of the most significant figures in the 20th century British monarchy, in a role that gave him access to the private reality of that figure's life with a completeness that no other person in her world matched. The interviews he gave across 5 years, shaped by the constraints already described, represent a portion of that access, small enough that their existence, however valuable, also serves as a document of their own incompleteness. The gaps are visible in the interviews themselves, for a reader attending to where the candor stops and the careful management begins. The political content of the Queen Mother's private opinions, present in the interviews as an indicated absence, a silhouette rather than a portrait. The specific character of her relationship with her elder daughter across 50 years of shared institutional existence, acknowledged as complex, never described with the specificity that would make the complexity comprehensible. The texture of the 1990s at Clarence House, when the family around the Queen Mother was navigating the Wales crisis and everything that followed it, gestured toward in terms of atmosphere, never filled in with the detail that the atmosphere would have required to fully understand. These gaps are not failures of Tallon's account. They are the product of the conditions under which the account was produced. Conditions that included the palace's management of his circumstances, the financial vulnerability that shaped which interviews he gave and to whom, and his own decisions about where the line between honesty and betrayal ran for a man who had loved the institution he was describing, even as he understood its treatment of him clearly. The decisions he made about those lines deserve more respect than they typically receive in discussions of his post-2002 interviews. He was not simply managing his legal exposure or protecting his housing situation, though both were real considerations. He was also making judgments about what the historical record required and what it could do without. Judgments informed by 51 years of understanding what information does when it enters the world and who it affects when it does. The judgments were sometimes too conservative, from the historical record's perspective. There are things he knew that would have completed pictures that remain incomplete, that would have corrected misunderstandings that the official account has permitted to persist, that would have provided the kind of primary evidence that historians of the period most need and most lack. He chose not to provide them, and the choosing was a genuine loss to the record. But the judgments were sometimes right, in ways that the historical record's perspective cannot fully accommodate, because the historical record's perspective is not the only perspective that matters. He knew things about real people that those people had shared in the context of a trust he had been given deliberately, and that had been the foundation of his access for half a century. Some of those things belonged to the historical record. Some of them belonged to the people who had shared them, and the people were real, and the reality of people is not resolved by their deaths in ways that make anything they ever shared in confidence automatically available for public consumption. He navigated this with more care than the standard account of him as a royal gossip acknowledges. The standard account reduces him to the entertaining source of colourful detail, the gin quantities, the social gatherings, the feuds, and the favourites and the particular characters of the people he had known. The entertaining detail is real, and it is genuinely valuable. It is also not the most significant thing he was doing in the 5 years of interviews. The most significant thing was the navigation, the ongoing, active, carefully maintained management of the boundary between what the historical record needed and what the people he had known were owed. The navigation produced a record that is simultaneously more complete than the palace's preferred version and less complete than the historical record's requirements. And the space between those two descriptions is where William Tallon's contribution to our understanding of the 20th century British monarchy actually lives. The scholars who have used his interviews as source material, and they have been used in the careful footnoted way that academic historians use contested sources as evidence of texture and atmosphere rather than as primary documentation of specific events, have generally handled them with the caution they warrant. The caution is appropriate. An interview given by a man in financial difficulty to journalists with their own editorial priorities, shaped by the constraints already described, is not the same kind of source as a contemporaneous diary or a formal memoir produced with full access to documentary evidence. But the caution should not obscure what the interviews actually are, which is the only account produced by the only person with the access Tallon had across the 51 years his access lasted. No comparable source exists. The authorized biographies of the Queen Mother, there are several, produced at different moments across the decades of her public life, were produced with palace cooperation and are shaped by the cooperation they required. The memoirs of the ladies-in-waiting who served alongside Tallon describe a view from a different position within the household and with the constraints that their own continued relationships with the palace imposed on their candor. Tallon's interviews are the closest thing available to an account from inside the daily reality of the household, produced by someone whose position gave him the most complete access to that reality, and whose post-2002 circumstances made candor both possible and, to a degree, necessary. Their value as historical sources is not diminished by the conditions under which they were produced. It is, if anything, increased by the awareness of those conditions, because the awareness allows the reader to calibrate what the source provides and to understand the constraints that shaped it. What the historical record that does not yet exist would look like if Tallon had produced a full memoir with the time and the resources and the freedom from the pressures that prevented the 5 years of interviews from reaching their natural extent, is something that can be approximated but not known. It would have been long. It would have been specific in ways the interviews could not be. It would have addressed the political dimensions of the Queen Mother's private character that the interviews indicated and then retreated from. It would have described the 1990s at Clarence House in ways that would have required the existing accounts of that decade to be substantially reconsidered. It would also, probably, have been more complicated about the Queen Mother herself than the interviews were, more willing to address the dimensions of her character that the love he bore for her made it difficult to present in their full complexity, the dimensions that the official account has always managed, and that even Tallon's most candid interviews never fully engaged with. The memoir does not exist. What exists instead is the archive of interviews, incomplete, shaped by their conditions, valuable beyond what their conditions might suggest, and collectively forming the nearest available approach to the account that the historical record would most benefit from having. The people who study the 20th century British monarchy will continue to use this archive. They will use it with appropriate caution and with the awareness of its limitations. They will find in it, despite the limitations, things that the official sources do not contain: the texture of a daily life, the private character of a significant person, the specific quality of a world that existed inside the palace walls, and that the palace has always had the strongest possible interest in ensuring the world outside those walls did not see clearly. They will also find, in reading the interviews carefully, the shape of what is missing, the silences that are not the silences of ignorance, but the silences of decision, the places where the navigation between candor and protection produced restraint rather than disclosure. Those silences are part of the archive too. They are, in some ways, the most informative part of it. The evidence that Tallon knew more than he said, thought more carefully about what he said than the entertaining surface of the interviews suggests, and made choices about the historical record that were genuinely choices rather than the simple product of what he happened to remember and what he happened to forget. He was not a historian. He had no training in the production of historical sources and no particular interest in the abstract question of what the historical record required. He was a man who had lived inside something significant and who had decided, in the years available to him after it ended, to describe what he had lived inside as honestly as the conditions of the description permitted. The conditions limited him. The honesty within those conditions was real. The combination produced something that the historical record of the 20th century British monarchy would be significantly poorer without, and that the record would have been richer still to have in full. It does not have it in full. The Kensington Palace apartment has been cleared. The interviews are in archives. The gaps in those interviews are permanent. What remains is enough to know that what is missing mattered, and specific enough to give us a sense, imprecise but genuine, of what the missing would have contained. That is more than most near misses leave behind. Institutions do not grieve. They adjust. They absorb the absence of the people who made them function, redistribute the functions those people performed, and continue operating with the efficiency that institutional continuity requires. The absorption is not indifference. It is the necessary response of a structure whose purpose exceeds any individual contribution to it, and whose survival depends on remaining larger than any single person it contains. The British royal household absorbed William Tallon's 51 years of contribution and his subsequent death with the institutional efficiency that this description implies. The functions he had performed were redistributed. The apartment was reassigned. The administrative record of his service exists in the files that royal households maintain about the people who serve them, accessible to the institution's internal processes and inaccessible to the public record in ways that are consistent with the palace's general approach to information about its domestic operations. His name appears in the authorized accounts of the Queen Mother's life as a presence, acknowledged, briefly characterized, assigned the role of devoted retainer, and moved on from quickly, because the authorized accounts of royal lives are accounts of the principal rather than the people around them, and the people around them appear primarily as evidence of the principal's human qualities rather than as subjects in their own right. This is the standard treatment. It is not unusual. It is the treatment that domestic staff in royal households have received in official accounts for as long as official accounts of royal households have been produced. The standard is not cruel in its intention. It is simply a reflection of the hierarchy that the institution maintains between the people whose lives it considers worth documenting and the people whose lives it considers worth employing. What makes Tallon's treatment by that standard notable is the specific gap it produces between the official account and the actual contribution. The gap is wider in his case than in most cases of royal household staff, because his contribution was wider, because the role he occupied went considerably beyond the formal description of that role, and because the formal description of that role was itself insufficient to capture what the role actually entailed across 5 decades of its performance. He ran the household. This is the fact that the authorized accounts acknowledge in terms that do not convey what the fact means. That without Tallon's daily management of the Queen Mother's domestic life, the domestic life that the official accounts describe would not have functioned in the way that those accounts require it to have functioned. The dignified breakfasts and the elegant gatherings and the comfortable progression of days that the Queen Mother's public image rested on were not self-generating. They were produced, every day, by a specific person performing specific acts of organization and management and care that the official account treats as a backdrop rather than as a contribution. The £10,000 bequest is the institution's own assessment of the contribution, expressed in the language that wills use when they are translating human significance into financial terms. The assessment is so evidently inadequate, so mismatched to the scale and the duration and the intimacy of what it is supposed to represent, that its inadequacy becomes, paradoxically, the most informative thing the official record contains about the relationship between the institution and the people who make it function. An institution that values 51 years of irreplaceable domestic service at £10,000 is an institution that has not valued the service. It has used the service. The distinction is not semantic. It is the distinction between a relationship in which both parties understand what is being exchanged and a relationship in which one party provides something of genuine value without the other party being required to acknowledge what it has received. Tallon understood this distinction. He had understood it for years before the Queen Mother's death made it concrete, had understood it in the way that people understand the terms of their situation when the situation has been sufficiently stable for long enough that examination feels unnecessary, and then find themselves examining it when the stability dissolves. The examination produced the interviews produced the record. The record is the documentation of what the institution took and what it returned, available to anyone who looks at it clearly enough to see what the looking reveals. What the looking reveals, across the complete body of Tallon's post-2002 interviews read in their entirety, is a portrait of an institution that is entirely capable of inspiring genuine love and loyalty in the people who serve it, and entirely incapable of recognizing the value of that love and loyalty in any terms that would require it to reciprocate proportionately. This combination, the inspiration and the incapacity, is not accidental, it is structural. The inspiration serves the institution's interest in retaining the people it needs. The incapacity serves the institution's interest in retaining those people at the minimum cost that their genuine love and loyalty makes sustainable. Tallon's love for the Queen Mother was real and was not manufactured by the institution's design. But the institution benefited from that love for 51 years without being required to account for the benefit, and the accounting that the £10,000 bequest represented was an accounting made by an institution rather than by the woman who was its subject, made by the legal and administrative machinery that manages the estates of royal figures, applying the standards that the machinery applies, producing the result that those standards produce when applied to a man whose role was never formally classified at the level his actual contribution warranted. The Queen Mother herself, in the years before her death, is reported by people close to her to have expressed concern about Tallon's future, to have indicated, in the way that she indicated things she found uncomfortable to address directly, that she understood the inadequacy of what the formal arrangements would provide, and that she wished something more could be done. Whether this expression of concern was communicated to the people responsible for the formal arrangements in terms specific enough to produce a different result is something the record does not establish. The result the record does establish is the result that the formal arrangements produced. She may have tried, the institution may have ignored what it inconvenient to act on, or the understanding may have remained at the level of expressed concern rather than formal instruction, which is the level at which concern in that world often remains when the practical steps required to translate it into action involve confronting systems whose operation the principle cannot directly override. Both possibilities are consistent with what is known about the Queen Mother's character and about the institution's management of such matters. What is consistent across all possibilities is the outcome. Tallon received £10,000. The institution received 51 years. The mathematics are not complicated. His legacy, in the conventional sense of what he left behind, is the interviews. They are his contribution to the historical record of a period and a world that the official sources have never adequately documented, and their value as that contribution is independent of the conditions under which they were produced and the limitations those conditions imposed. Future historians of the 20th century British monarchy will read them. Future biographers of the Queen Mother will use them. The picture they construct of daily life inside Clarence House will be more accurate for having Tallon's account available, and more incomplete for having only the fraction of it that the circumstances of his final years permitted. His legacy in the human sense, the sense that matters more than the historical one, is harder to document because it exists in the experiences of the people who knew him rather than in any record those experiences produced. The former colleagues who remained in contact through the final years. The people from the Clarence House social world whose connection to him survived the dissolution of the world that had created it. The individuals who encountered him in the post-2002 interviews and found someone more complex and more honest and more genuinely themselves than the Backstairs Billy caricature that the coverage had produced. He was more than the caricature. He was more than the devoted retainer of the official account. He was more than the royal gossip of the tabloid coverage, and more than the historical source of the academic footnotes. He was a person who had chosen, at 16, to place himself in a world that was not his by birth, and that would never be his by ownership, and who had inhabited that world for 51 years with a completeness that the world's eventual indifference to him does not diminish. The indifference was institutional, the inhabitation was personal. The personal outlasts the institutional in the only register where outlasting matters, in the quality of the life that was lived, rather than in the assessment the institution made of its value. He walked into a palace at 16 from a city that the war had broken and rebuilt, and that had no particular provision for someone with his specific combination of ambition and perception and social intelligence and the particular aesthetic sensibility that 50 years of the best available company would develop into something extraordinary. He found a world that could use all of those things. He gave all of them, for 51 years, without reservation, and without the security that a different kind of institution might have provided in return. He talked, at the end, about what he had seen. The talking was braver than it appears in retrospect, conducted from a position of genuine vulnerability against institutional pressure that was real, if invisible, produced at personal cost, that the coverage of the interviews never adequately registered. He died in November in a palace apartment, surrounded by objects that were his own, in the only sense available to someone who had never owned the space they lived in, the sense of having chosen them, arranged them, and lived among them long enough that the choosing and the arranging had become a form of ownership that property law does not recognize, and that is no less real for that. The palace that housed him did not mark his passing with any formal statement. The woman he had served for 51 years had been dead for 5 years. The institution that had benefited from both of them continued without interruption, absorbing the loss with the efficiency that institutional continuity requires. Outside the apartment window, Kensington Palace continued to be what it had always been, a building full of people who had placed themselves in the service of something larger than themselves, navigating the terms of that placement with whatever combination of love and calculation and genuine commitment the terms produced in each individual case. Tallon had navigated those terms for longer than almost anyone. He had navigated them with more completeness, more genuine investment, and ultimately more honesty than the institution he served had any right to expect, given what it offered in return. He deserved better than £10,000. He deserved better than 5 years of institutional cold in an apartment he did not own. He deserved the acknowledgement that the institution is structurally incapable of providing. The acknowledgement that the people who make royal households function are not backdrops to the lives of the people they serve, but are themselves people, living lives of their own significance, whose contribution to the institution's survival and dignity is not adequately captured by the formal descriptions of their roles or the financial terms of their departure. He did not receive that acknowledgement. He received a nickname, a fraction of a memoir's worth of interviews, a £10,000 check, and an apartment that was eventually returned to the institution that had always owned it. It was not enough. It was what the institution provided. The gap between those two facts is William Tallon's most enduring legacy. Not what he said about the royal family, not the colour and the candour of the interviews, not the specific details that future historians will footnote and future documentaries will quote, but the gap itself. The gap between what a life of genuine service deserves and what this particular institution, in this particular case, chose to provide. The gap is not unusual. It is the standard gap. William Tallon's story makes it visible in a way that the standard gap usually is not, because he was articulate enough to describe what he had given, honest enough to imply what he had received in return, and present enough in the public record to make the comparison possible for anyone willing to make it. The comparison is not comfortable. It was not meant to be. He made it anyway. That, in the end, is what Backstairs Billy actually was. Not a devoted retainer, not a royal gossip, not a colourful character of the servant class. A man who spent his life making someone else's world beautiful, and who spent his final years making the cost of that beauty visible. The visibility is his monument. It will outlast the institution's indifference, as honesty generally does. Backstairs Billy. The nickname arrived the way nicknames arrive in closed worlds, organically, without a single identifiable moment of coinage, through the accumulated usage of people who needed a shorthand for something they encountered regularly and wanted to refer to quickly. The backstairs of a royal household are not a metaphor. They are a physical reality. The service corridors and secondary staircases that large domestic establishments have always maintained to allow the people who make them function to move through them without intersecting with the people whose comfort the functioning serves. Tallon used the backstairs. He used everything the household contained as a tool of his work, and the backstairs were the tool of someone who understood that invisibility, in a domestic context, is not the same as insignificance. The nickname stuck because it contained a truth about how the institution categorized him as a backstairs figure, a service entrance presence, a person whose access to the household's most private spaces was professional rather than personal, and whose use of that access was therefore a form of subordination rather than a form of trust. The categorization was wrong in ways that the people who applied the nickname understood on some level and chose not to examine. It was easier to call him Backstairs Billy than to engage with the more complicated reality that the nickname was designed to contain. That the person moving through the backstairs corridors was not a marginal figure, but a central one, and that the margin and the center of that particular household were not where the formal structure suggested they were. The myth that accumulated around the nickname across the decades of his service and the 5 years of interviews that followed it is a myth with several layers, and the layers contradict each other in ways that the myth's consumers have generally preferred not to notice. The first layer is the palace's myth, the devoted retainer, selflessly committed to his mistress's comfort, a figure of institutional loyalty whose entire significance is derived from the significance of the person he served. This layer served the palace's interest in presenting its domestic staff as an extension of its own dignity, rather than as independent human beings with their own claims on the historical record. The second layer is the tabloid myth, the gossipy insider, the man who knew where the bodies were buried and was finally, deliciously, prepared to indicate their general location, if not their precise coordinates. This layer served the press's interest in a figure who could provide royal material while being sufficiently outside the formal royal structure to provide it without the legal exposure that a more central figure would have faced. Backstairs Billy, in this version, was useful precisely because his backstairs status made him simultaneously knowledgeable and deniable, someone whose account carried the authority of proximity without the authority of position. The third layer is the posthumous myth, the character, the original, the man who brought warmth and color and genuine human eccentricity to a world that the official account has always presented as cold and managed and deliberately remote from the kind of personality that Tallon embodied. This layer is the most affectionate and the least accurate, because it reduces him to his entertainment value and in doing so performs, in a warmer register, exactly the same reduction that the palace's myth performed in a colder one. A character is a person whose complexity has been resolved into a set of memorable attributes. Tallon was not a character, he was a person, and the difference matters. The actual man, the one beneath all three layers of myth, is the one the interviews provide access to, imperfectly and incompletely, in the gaps between the versions that other people's interests required. He was intelligent in a way that his lack of formal education consistently caused people to underestimate, which was an underestimation he was aware of, and which he used with the deliberate skill of someone who has learned that being underestimated is a form of freedom. He was observant with the specific quality of observation that develops in people who have spent decades in rooms where powerful people say things they would not say if they believed they were fully attended to. He was funny with the timing of someone who has absorbed, through 50 years of proximity, the conversational rhythms of the people who are best at being funny in the English tradition, the dry, the specific, the observation delivered at the angle that makes it land, rather than at the angle that makes it obvious. He was also, beneath the social fluency and the professional composure and the managed presentation that 50 years of royal service had made second nature, someone who needed the world he had chosen to inhabit in a way that went beyond professional commitment. He had needed it since he was 16. The need was not weakness, it was the specific form that his particular kind of ambition took, an ambition not for individual achievement in the conventional sense, but for membership in a world whose quality he recognized and wanted to be part of. The world had given him membership. It had given him 51 years of the thing he had chosen it for, proximity to people who were genuinely interesting, immersion in a domestic life, conducted at a level of aesthetic quality that his native Coventry had not suggested was available to someone from his background, and the particular satisfaction of doing something difficult with complete competence over a sustained period. These are not trivial gifts. They are the things that people who choose their work well receive from it, and Tallon had chosen well in the specific sense that he had found the work that used all of him rather than some of him. The cost was the cost that any total commitment produces, the absence of an alternative. He had no parallel life, no other world to return to when the primary one dissolved. The dissolution was therefore total in a way that partial commitments do not produce, and the totality of it was the condition of the final 5 years rather than the exception within them. What the nickname captured, inadvertently, was this totality. Backstairs Billy was a person who had given himself entirely to a backstairs role, not in the diminished sense that the institution intended by the category, but in the complete sense that the category, accurately understood, contained. The backstairs are where the real work of a household happens. They are where the decisions are made that make the front-of-house presentation possible. They are where the person who actually runs things runs them, away from the eyes of the people whose comfort the running serves, and whose understanding of what the running requires has always been, necessarily and deliberately, incomplete. He ran things from the backstairs for 51 years. The front of house received the credit. The backstairs received a nickname. The nickname is now the primary way his name is known to the people who know it, which is itself a document of the relationship between the institution and the people who serve it, a relationship in which the serving is acknowledged in the most reductive available form, and the server is remembered by the form of the acknowledgement, rather than by the substance of what was served. Future accounts of the Queen Mother's life will continue to use Tallon's interviews as sources. They will footnote him as Backstairs Billy. The footnotes will indicate the interviews, the years, the approximate content. They will not indicate the conditions under which the interviews were given, the financial vulnerability that shaped their production, the institutional pressure that defined their limits, or the 51 years of complete professional service that preceded them and that the £10,000 bequest declined to value adequately. The footnotes are the palace's final management of William Tallon, the reduction of a person to a source, of a source to a nickname, of a nickname to a footnote. The reduction is efficient. It is consistent with the institution's treatment of him across the entirety of his association with it. It places him, permanently, in the category that the institution always assigned him to, the backstairs category, the service entrance category, the category of people whose significance is derived entirely from the significance of the people they served, and who have no independent claim on the historical record's attention. The claim exists regardless of whether the record acknowledges it. He made it himself, in 5 years of interviews conducted from a Kensington Palace apartment, under conditions that the record does not adequately describe, about a world that the record has never adequately documented, with an honesty that the conditions of his final years make genuinely remarkable, rather than simply entertaining. Backstairs Billy, the name that the institution gave him, the name that the press repeated, the name that the obituaries used. Not the name that 51 years of irreplaceable service earned him, because that name would have required the institution to produce a category of acknowledgement it has never developed and has no interest in developing, a category for the people who make the front of house possible and who receive, in the final accounting, a nickname and a footnote and £10,000. He deserved a different name. The name he received tells you more about the institution than it tells you about him. That, in its own way, is the most accurate thing the nickname ever communicated, not who William Tallon was, but what the world he inhabited thought he was worth. The world was wrong. The interviews are the evidence. The evidence is permanent. The man who moved through the backstairs of the grandest household in Britain for 51 years left behind, in the end, something that the front of house has never managed to produce, an honest account of what the backstairs actually contained. That account will outlast the nickname. It will outlast the footnotes. It will outlast, eventually, the institution's preferred version of events, because honest accounts of real things have a durability that managed versions do not. Backstairs Billy, the last word the institution had about him, not the last word. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.